They were the steel fist of Hitler's war machine, the armored spearheads that thundered across Europe and gave birth to the legend of Blitzkrieg. From the dusty fields of Poland in 1939 to the frozen steppes of Russia and the deserts of North Africa, the Panzer Divisions were more than just tanks. They were the embodiment of modern mechanized warfare. Their engines roared like rolling thunder, their tracks chewed up the earth, and their crews became symbols of a new terrifying form of mobility and destruction. But behind the image of unstoppable power lay stories of innovation and improvisation, of triumph and failure, of men fighting inside cramped steel coffins where survival often hinged on seconds. The Panzer Divisions redefined how wars were fought, blending speed, coordination, and firepower into a deadly formula that stunned the world. And yet, as the war dragged on, their strength was tested to breaking point, outmatched by Allied industry, outnumbered in men and machines, and forced into desperate defensive battles that eroded their myth of invincibility. Tonight, as you settle in, join us on a journey deep into the history of these divisions, their rise, their glory, their collapse, and their legacy in shaping the face of modern warfare. This is not just the story of tanks, but of the men inside them, the battles they fought, and the lessons they left behind. So get comfortable, let the weight of history unfold, and tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time of day are you listening? Your thoughts and voices keep this channel alive, and your support ensures that stories like this one continue to be told. The story of the Panzer Divisions begins not in 1939, with the invasion of Poland, but decades earlier, in the mud-filled trenches of the First World War. It was here, amid barbed wire, artillery craters, and endless stalemate, that the concept of mechanized breakthrough first emerged. Tanks, first fielded by the British in 1916, were crude, slow, and prone to mechanical failure, yet they shattered the illusion of static warfare. German commanders, though initially caught off guard, quickly studied these new machines and recognized their potential. The collapse of trench defenses before armored vehicles convinced military thinkers that the future of war would be fought with speed and steel. Yet, in the aftermath of defeat, the Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of the right to develop tanks. The German army, the Reichswehr, was reduced to 100,000 men and forbidden from possessing heavy weapons. But ideas cannot be outlawed, and inside clandestine military circles, discussions about armored warfare continued. Young officers and veterans began sketching concepts for mobile battle formations, even as their nation was forbidden from building them. The seed of Blitzkrieg was planted in the frustration of a defeated empire, and in those quiet years of limitation, German military thinkers turned imagination into doctrine. The Treaty of Versailles attempted to chain Germany's military potential, but the Germans responded with secrecy and subterfuge. Unable to openly construct tanks, they rebranded them as tractors in training manuals and camouflage projects. The Reichswehr, though small, became a school of innovation where every officer was expected to think strategically. Germany forged secret partnerships with the Soviet Union, sending officers eastward to conduct experiments with armored vehicles on Soviet soil. Training grounds near Kazan allowed German and Soviet crews to test the future of mechanized warfare away from prying Allied eyes. In this clandestine environment, young officers experimented with ideas far more advanced than their contemporaries in Britain or France. They studied mobility, coordination, and the fusion of infantry, tanks, and aircraft. While the world thought Germany was disarmed, German officers were sketching the outlines of modern armored divisions. These secret maneuvers provided the laboratory for doctrines that would later shock Europe. The Versailles restrictions, instead of smothering German innovation, paradoxically sharpened it. Deprived of numbers, they emphasized quality, efficiency, and speed. and by the late 1920s, German armored theory was quietly maturing behind the veil of imposed weakness. Into this environment of secrecy and frustration emerged visionaries who would shape the destiny of armored warfare. Among them was Heinz Guderian, a restless and brilliant officer who believed tanks should not merely support infantry, but dominate the battlefield independently. Guderian devoured military literature, studying British theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart, who advocated mechanized warfare. But unlike many in Britain or France, Guderian insisted on integrating tanks with radios, enabling real-time coordination that transformed theory into practical doctrine. He envisioned armored columns that could punch through enemy lines and then keep moving, supported by motorized infantry, artillery, and aircraft. This idea was not just about tanks, but about speed, communication, and relentless pressure. Guderian's catchphrase, "Nicht klecken, klotzen," not fiddling about, but going in with full force, captured his aggressive spirit. His writings and lectures electrified a generation of officers eager to escape the ghosts of static trench warfare. By the early 1930s, Guderian was pushing for concentrated armored divisions rather than dispersing tanks piecemeal among infantry. His theories gave structure to a weapon still unborn in German factories, and his insistence on radios in every tank would give the Panzers their decisive edge in the coming storm. While Guderian crafted theory, the political climate shifted in ways that would allow practice to follow. The rise of Adolf Hitler in 1933 brought not only dictatorship, but also the promise of rearmament. Hitler, obsessed with overturning Versailles and expanding German power, gave the army the resources it had been denied. Factories once producing tractors and trucks were redirected toward armored vehicle development. Engineers experimented with light designs such as the Panzer I and Tassit, which were modest in firepower but invaluable in training crews. These early machines were stepping stones, a way to train officers and soldiers in tactics that would later be applied with heavier tanks. Hitler's regime poured money into mechanization, believing speed and surprise would be Germany's answer to numerically superior enemies. The Panzerwaffe, the armored branch, became the darling of the Nazi propaganda machine, symbolizing modernity and unstoppable power. Parades showcased columns of tanks rolling past cheering crowds, even though most were lightly armed training vehicles. For Guderian and his peers, this was enough. Finally, the theoretical doctrines could be tested with steel and oil. The dream of mobile warfare was escaping the pages of notebooks and taking shape on the fields of Germany. The world, however, underestimated the significance of these developments. France and Britain, veterans of the First World War, clung to defensive doctrines centered on fortifications and infantry-heavy strategies. The Maginot Line epitomized their belief that concrete and artillery could prevent another German invasion. In contrast, the Germans were quietly preparing to bypass such obstacles with mechanized speed. They studied how to use tanks, not as support tools, but as the spearhead of combined arms formations. Motorized infantry would ride in trucks close behind tanks, while mobile artillery and engineers followed to maintain momentum. Most revolutionary of all, dive bombers like the Ju-87 Stuka would fly overhead, smashing enemy strongpoints and spreading panic. This orchestration of land and air assets was unlike anything Europe had seen. By the mid-1930s, war games and maneuvers demonstrated these ideas in practice. Officers saw firsthand how speed and coordination could collapse a defensive line, and yet outside observers often dismissed these maneuvers as spectacle, failing to see the revolution unfolding in Germany's military thought. Inside Germany, the evolution of the Panzer force was not without resistance. Traditionalists in the army clung to cavalry and infantry, viewing tanks as auxiliaries rather than decisive weapons. Critics argued that tanks lacked the staying power of infantry and would break down under sustained combat. But Guderian and his allies pushed back fiercely, citing both their studies and limited exercises that demonstrated armored speed. They argued that tanks, properly concentrated, could create breakthroughs no infantry could achieve. The debate raged within the officer corps, yet the momentum of political and industrial backing tipped the scales. By 1935, the Panzerwaffe had been formally established, with its first divisions taking shape. Training grounds echoed with the rumble of engines, and soldiers learned to maneuver in coordinated armored thrusts. Radio drills, combined arms exercises, and relentless emphasis on mobility became the hallmarks of the new force. Guderian himself took command of armored units, proving his ideas in practice. By the eve of war, the skeptics had been largely silenced, and the Panzer Divisions stood ready as the sharp edge of Hitler's sword. The international community, still weary from the First World War, watched Germany's growing mechanization with unease. Treaties had been violated openly, yet the policy of appeasement allowed Hitler to continue unchecked. British and French observers attended German maneuvers, but many dismissed them as exaggerated demonstrations. They underestimated the significance of radios in tanks, believing the vehicles were too fragile for decisive operations. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had developed large tank formations, but suffered from purges that crippled its officer corps. Thus, by 1939, Germany had crafted a unique balance: smaller numbers of tanks compared to rivals, but superior organization and doctrine. The Panzer Divisions were not just tanks, they were integrated battle machines, combining speed, shock, and coordination. The seeds sown in secret training grounds, and refined by visionaries like Guderian, had blossomed into operational reality. In less than 2 decades, Germany had transformed from a nation forbidden from building tanks to the master of armored doctrine. Europe was unprepared for the storm that was about to be unleashed, and when it came, it would redefine warfare for generations to come. Thus, the birth of Blitzkrieg was not a single invention, but the culmination of years of thought, secrecy, and preparation. From the muddy lessons of the First World War to clandestine experiments in Soviet fields, the doctrine was forged in adversity. From the constraints of Versailles emerged an obsession with speed and surprise. From the determination of men like Heinz Guderian came the insistence that tanks were not mere support, but the heart of modern war. By 1939, the Panzer Divisions were ready, their crews drilled, their radios tuned, and their commanders primed for lightning strikes. What began as theory had become reality, and reality would soon become terror on the battlefields of Europe. The world still clung to the old war, but the Germans were preparing a new one. Blitzkrieg was not about attrition, but about annihilation, not about endurance, but about shock. The Panzers were not built to grind down opponents slowly, but to collapse them swiftly. And in September 1939, the world would see this doctrine in action. The birth of Blitzkrieg was complete. Its proving ground would be Poland. The journey from theory to steel began in the mid-1930s, with the creation of Germany's first armored vehicles. Because the Treaty of Versailles forbade tank construction, the German military had to disguise its initial designs as agricultural machines, officially labeled tractors. This clever camouflage allowed engineers to design armored prototypes under the watchful eyes of foreign inspectors without raising suspicion. The Panzer I, Germany's first production tank, was a lightweight vehicle designed primarily for training rather than battlefield dominance. Its thin armor and 2 machine guns meant it could never stand against heavier foreign tanks. Yet for German soldiers, the Panzer I was invaluable, providing the first real platform on which to practice armored doctrine. It introduced crews to the mechanics of tank warfare, communication, gunnery, and mobility. Every unit trained in these vehicles was laying the foundation for future armored operations. These machines were not meant to win battles, but to teach soldiers how battles would be won. In factories and training grounds, the Panzer I became the classroom of the Panzerwar. What it lacked in firepower, it made up for in shaping the mindset of German armored forces. And in this humble beginning, the first seeds of Blitzkrieg's execution were sown. German industry in the early 1930s was not yet prepared to mass-produce advanced tanks. Years of economic depression and restrictions from Versailles had left production facilities underdeveloped. The Reich's rearmament program, launched by Hitler, demanded rapid scaling of industries that had lain dormant. Firms such as Krupp, Mayenne, Daimler-Benz, and Henschel became the backbone of tank production, racing to catch up with Germany's ambitions. Yet steel shortages, limited machine tools, and competing demands from the Luftwaffe and Navy made progress slow. To accelerate readiness, the Germans decided to build the Panzer I in large numbers, using its simplicity to train both workers and soldiers. More than 1,000 were produced, not to overwhelm enemies, but to master the logistics of mass production. Engineers gained critical experience in welding, assembly lines, and armored design, which would later be applied to larger tanks. It was a stepping stone, not just for crews, but for industry itself. The Panzer I thus became a symbol of Germany's determination to rebuild its military under severe constraints. By 1936, these light tanks were rolling off production lines in ever greater numbers, and with them came the birth of a new armored culture. While the Panzer I was adequate for training, German commanders knew they needed a more capable combat vehicle. This led to the development of the Panzer II, conceived as an interim design until heavier models could be produced. Unlike its predecessor, the Panzer II mounted a 20 mm cannon, giving it at least some chance against lightly armored opponents. Its armor was still thin, vulnerable to even modest anti-tank weapons, but its speed and agility made it a more dangerous battlefield presence. Production began in 1936, and hundreds were issued to the rapidly expanding Panzer Divisions. Soldiers learned not only how to maneuver, but also how to coordinate fire and movement under real combat conditions. The Panzer II was pressed into frontline service during early campaigns, despite being originally intended only as a temporary solution. In Spain during the Civil War, German crews tested its effectiveness against Soviet-supplied armor. These lessons revealed its weaknesses, but also the value of combined arms tactics that emphasized speed over brute strength. It was never the tank of the future, but it bridged the gap between concept and reality, and in doing so, it became the first German tank to truly feel the weight of combat. The Panzer II was thus both a teacher and a fighter. The Spanish Civil War provided the Germans with a live laboratory for testing their early Panzer designs. Deployed as part of the Condor Legion, Panzer I and D tanks clashed with Soviet-built T-26s, which were more heavily armed and armored. German crews quickly discovered that their light tanks were no match for enemy firepower, yet these defeats proved invaluable. Exposing the shortcomings of design and doctrine, it became clear that tanks could not fight in isolation, but needed support from artillery, infantry, and aircraft. German officers studied these lessons carefully, refining Blitzkrieg into a doctrine of coordination rather than tank supremacy alone. Radios in German tanks gave them an edge in communication, even when outgunned, Maneuver, surprise, and teamwork compensated for technical inferiority. Though losses in Spain were sobering, they hardened German resolve to push for more advanced designs. The experience validated Guderian's insistence on combined arms warfare. The Panzer I and D-TES had limitations, but they created a framework for learning under fire. And by the end of the Spanish Civil War, Germany was better prepared for the storm to come. Training was central to the Panzerwaffe's development, and the early years were defined by relentless exercises. Maneuvers disguised as tractor operations allowed armored units to practice openly while technically staying within Versailles restrictions. German soldiers drove their vehicles across fields, learning how to maintain momentum and discipline in formations. They practiced coordinating with trucks carrying infantry and artillery units that were motorized to keep pace. Engineers simulated river crossings, while reconnaissance units scouted ahead for weaknesses in the enemy line. These exercises, though seemingly routine, built the confidence and muscle memory required for large-scale operations. The emphasis was always on speed and precision, reflecting Guderian's philosophy. Tank crews drilled tirelessly with radios, perfecting the art of communication under stress. Commanders learned to adapt, to exploit gaps instantly, and to never allow the enemy time to recover. Even the limitations of the Panzer I and Anti forced innovation, as officers learned to use maneuver and coordination to compensate for firepower. In these years, the Panzerwaffe became less an experimental branch and more a professional force. And by 1939, it was ready to unleash its doctrine upon Europe. The Panzer Divisions themselves were carefully constructed to maximize mobility and coordination. They were not simply collections of tanks, but balanced formations of infantry, artillery, engineers, and support units. The light tank served as the spearhead, but motorized infantry ensured breakthroughs were exploited and held. Artillery was mounted on trucks to follow quickly, while engineers cleared obstacles in the path of the advance. Reconnaissance units scouted enemy positions, providing commanders with critical intelligence. Every element was designed to move at the speed of armor, avoiding the stagnation that had plagued the First World War. This integration was revolutionary compared to Allied armies, where tanks were often dispersed piecemeal. The Panzerwaffe functioned as a self-contained weapon of war, capable of independent operations. Training exercises revealed the power of this system, especially when combined with Luftwaffe air support. The Panzer Divisions were not yet invincible, but they were unlike anything Europe had seen, and within their evolving structure lay the core of Blitzkrieg. It was not just the tank, but the synergy, that made them formidable. Industry continued to refine designs, but shortages remained a constant challenge. Germany lacked the resources to match the massive tank programs of the Soviet Union. Steel, rubber, and fuel were in short supply, forcing compromises in production. To compensate, German engineers emphasized reliability, speed, and communication rather than brute strength. The Panzer INTO, though light, could be built quickly in large numbers. Their role was never to dominate the battlefield individually, but to create the illusion of strength through coordination. Propaganda amplified their presence, showcasing columns of tanks rolling past crowds as symbols of modernity. German newspapers and films presented them as invincible weapons of the Reich, even as soldiers knew their limits. This propaganda, however, served a purpose. It boosted morale at home and intimidated potential enemies abroad. The Panzerwaffe was sold as the face of a rejuvenated military power, and in doing so, it cemented the psychological impact of German armor. The myth of the Panzer was born before its true might existed, and soon reality would catch up with image. By the eve of the Second World War, Germany's armored force was still in its infancy, Most divisions were equipped with Panzer I and II tanks, vehicles that were obsolete compared to foreign designs. Yet their crews were among the best trained and most disciplined in Europe. More importantly, they fought as part of a doctrine that emphasized coordination and speed. What the Germans lacked in armor thickness and firepower, they made up for with radios, mobility, and ruthless efficiency. Exercises had instilled a culture of initiative, where junior officers were encouraged to exploit opportunities. The Panzerwaffe was not yet ready for prolonged tank duels, but it was prepared to collapse static defenses. Poland, France, and beyond would soon reveal the devastating impact of doctrine over design. The Panzer I and II, though weak on paper, would prove deadly in practice. They were the stepping stones to greater machines that were still on the drawing board. And though they would soon be outclassed, their role in shaping Blitzkrieg cannot be overstated. The Panzers had been built, not yet perfect, but ready for war. When the concept of armored divisions moved from theory to practice, the German High Command understood that tanks alone would never be enough. A Panzer Division was not merely a collection of armored vehicles. It was a carefully designed organism where every branch worked together with precision. The division typically included 2 regiments of tanks, supported by mechanized infantry that could advance at the same speed. Motorized artillery provided devastating firepower to suppress enemy strongpoints. Engineers ensured rivers, minefields, and obstacles did not halt the armored spearhead. Reconnaissance units scouted enemy lines, probing for weak spots and reporting swiftly through radio communication. Signals battalions ensured that every commander, from divisional headquarters down to platoon leaders, remained in contact during battle. Supply and logistics units followed closely, bringing fuel, ammunition, and food to keep the advance moving. The structure was balanced, mobile, and ruthless in its efficiency. Every element was designed to maintain momentum, preventing the stalemates of trench warfare. In this, the Germans had forged something revolutionary, a division built entirely around speed, shock, and synergy. The Panzer Division was a weapon of motion. At its core, the division revolved around its tanks. But even here, the Germans emphasized flexibility. In the early war years, a typical Panzer Division might field around 300 tanks, though many were still light Panzer I and II models. These were organized into battalions and companies, each with specific roles on the battlefield. The tanks were never meant to fight in isolation. Their task was to punch holes in the enemy line. Once those gaps appeared, motorized infantry surged forward in trucks or half-tracks, securing the ground gained. Artillery, mounted on trucks or tracked vehicles, rained shells upon enemy strongpoints to keep defenders disoriented. Anti-aircraft units, armed with the feared 88 mm guns, ensured the division could protect itself from hostile aircraft. This integration gave the division a unique adaptability, allowing it to shift seamlessly from breakthrough to exploitation. Unlike Allied armies, where tanks were often dispersed among infantry brigades, the Germans concentrated their armor for maximum effect. This concentration turned local superiority into operational shockwaves, and in those moments of sudden collapse, the Panzer Division's strength revealed itself. It was a doctrine born of necessity, but executed with daring. The infantry element of the Panzer Division was equally crucial to its success. Known as Panzer Grenadiers, these soldiers were motorized or mechanized, traveling in trucks or armored half-tracks that allowed them to keep pace with tanks. Their role was to dismount at key moments, clearing enemy infantry from villages, forests, or defensive lines that tanks alone could not conquer. The Panzer Grenadiers carried light machine guns, anti-tank rifles, and mortars, providing the close support that armored spearheads desperately required. They also acted as protectors, shielding tanks from ambushes in terrain unsuited for armor. This integration of infantry directly into armored operations was a major departure from World War I, where tanks had often advanced unsupported. German commanders saw tanks and infantry as partners rather than separate arms. The Panzer Grenadiers gave the division staying power, enabling breakthroughs to be held and expanded. Their mobility meant they could respond quickly to threats along the flanks. In practice, they were the glue holding the fast-moving division together. Without them, the Panzer would have been an isolated hammer. With them, it became a self-sustaining fist. Artillery inside the Panzer Division reflected the same principle of mobility. Unlike the slow, horse-drawn artillery of the First World War, German guns were mounted on trucks or light-tracked vehicles. This allowed them to move quickly and provide direct support during advances. Light howitzers bombarded infantry positions, while heavier pieces targeted enemy artillery batteries. The presence of self-propelled guns meant firepower could follow tanks into hostile territory. Anti-tank artillery added another layer of protection, reinforcing the division's ability to resist counterattacks. Notably, the 88 mm gun, though designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, proved devastating against enemy armor. German artillery officers trained to work closely with tank commanders, synchronizing fire missions with armored thrusts. This coordination allowed breakthroughs to occur with fewer pauses, preventing defenders from reorganizing. Artillery was no longer a static arm, but a mobile partner in the armored storm. The Panzer Division's guns, always on the move, made it an advancing wall of steel and fire. It was a revolution in how armies conceived of fire support. Communications were perhaps the most overlooked but vital part of the Panzer Division's success. Every German tank was equipped with a radio, a feature lacking in most Allied designs at the start of the war. This gave commanders the ability to redirect forces on the fly, responding instantly to opportunities or dangers. In battle, radio traffic allowed multiple tanks to coordinate their fire on key targets. Reconnaissance units fed information directly to divisional headquarters, ensuring commanders had a real-time picture of the battlefield. Signal units, equipped with trucks carrying radio masts and encrypted systems, extended communication deep into enemy territory. This flow of information allowed German operations to remain fluid, avoiding the rigidity that often paralyzed opponents. Allied tanks, by contrast, often relied on flag signals or messengers, costing them precious minutes in combat. The Panzer divisions thrived on this speed of decision-making, magnifying their effectiveness. In a war of movement, information was as deadly as firepower, and it was the Panzerwaffe that mastered it first. Communication was the nervous system of the armored force. Support and logistics, though less glamorous, were the lifeblood of the Panzer Division. Fuel trucks followed armored spearheads, ensuring tanks never ran dry in the middle of a breakthrough. Ammunition convoys supplied artillery and infantry with a constant flow of shells and bullets. Maintenance crews worked tirelessly, repairing damaged vehicles under fire or salvaging parts from wrecks. Field kitchens, medical units, and supply depots moved forward almost as quickly as the tanks themselves. Without this backbone, no division could sustain the tempo of operations demanded by Blitzkrieg. German planners devoted enormous resources to keeping divisions supplied, though shortages often became severe as campaigns lengthened. Despite these difficulties, the logistics units of the Panzerwaffe became known for their resilience. Soldiers often joked that fuel was more important than bullets, and in many ways it was true. The speed of armored warfare meant that one stalled convoy could halt an entire division. To maintain momentum, every man from mechanic to cook played a role. It was an army in motion where every gear turned toward victory. The revolutionary aspect of the Panzer Division lay not only in its components, but in how they worked together. Tanks, infantry, artillery, engineers, and signals were fused into a single striking force. Unlike older armies that treated each arm as separate, the Germans combined them into a seamless whole. This doctrine was called combined arms, and it transformed how wars would be fought. No single weapon decided the outcome. It was the harmony of all branches moving at the same pace. Blitzkrieg relied on this balance, with tanks breaking through, infantry consolidating, artillery suppressing, and aircraft providing support from above. The division could act independently, exploiting gaps faster than enemy generals could react. The result was a form of warfare that paralyzed opponents and shattered their cohesion. Enemies accustomed to slow, methodical battles were overwhelmed by the speed and coordination of these units. The Panzer Division embodied the fusion of technology, doctrine, and organization. It was not simply stronger than the sum of its parts. It was exponentially more powerful, and it changed modern warfare forever. By 1939, the Panzer Division stood ready as Germany's most formidable tool of conquest. They were not perfect. Many still relied on light tanks, and their logistics could falter under strain. Yet, compared to their opponents, they represented a revolution in military design. Each division was a moving fortress, capable of breaking through, exploiting, and holding ground without waiting for reinforcements. The Allies did not yet grasp the implications of this synergy, believing tanks were best used in small numbers to support infantry. The Germans thought differently. They concentrated their armor, creating shockwaves of steel that rolled across Europe. In Poland and France, these divisions would prove their worth, shattering enemy defenses in days. Their structure, born of necessity and vision, became the model for modern mechanized armies. The Panzer Division was more than a military unit. It was the embodiment of Blitzkrieg itself. Its creation marked the point where theory and practice merged into a devastating reality. And soon the world would feel the power of this new weapon of war. On September 1st, 1939, the Panzer Divisions crossed the Polish frontier, marking their baptism of fire in modern warfare. Hitler's gamble to ignite a general European war rested heavily on these newly formed armored units. At dawn, the sound of engines and treads echoed across the countryside as tanks rolled through fields, villages, and forests. German planners sought a campaign of speed, designed to overwhelm Poland before France or Britain could intervene decisively. The Panzer Divisions were tasked with leading this assault, striking deep into the enemy's heartland. Their role was not merely to fight battles, but to dislocate the entire Polish defense. The divisions concentrated their strength at key points, bypassing fortified zones and smashing through weaker positions. Reconnaissance patrols probed for vulnerabilities, relaying targets back to the spearheads. Aircraft of the Luftwaffe roared overhead, hammering Polish airfields, bridges, and troop movements. In this synchronized ballet of war, Poland faced a storm unlike anything seen in the previous conflict. Blitzkrieg had arrived, and its vanguard wore steel tracks. Yet for all its confidence, the Panzerwaffe was about to learn hard lessons in war. The German armored forces in Poland consisted of 6 Panzer Divisions and 4 light divisions, totaling roughly 2,700 tanks. At first glance, this number seemed formidable, but appearances were deceptive. Nearly half of these tanks were the light Panzer, armed with nothing more than machine guns. Another large share were Panzer II models, carrying only a 20 mm cannon, incapable of penetrating heavy armor. Only a minority of the force fielded the more effective Panzer and IV, which were still in limited production. Against the Polish army's modest tank force, these weaknesses mattered less than they would, against a stronger adversary. Still, German crews quickly realized the vulnerability of their light vehicles when facing Polish 37 anti-tank guns. Battles around Mokra and Piotrków revealed the cost of inadequate armor, as panzers were destroyed in alarming numbers. What saved the Germans was not the individual tank, but the combined coordination of the division. The Luftwaffe silenced many Polish batteries before they could inflict further losses. It was a foretaste of how Blitzkrieg required synchronization to succeed. Without air and artillery partners, the panzers were dangerously exposed. The Polish campaign revealed the immense advantage of concentration and speed. German tank commanders refused to disperse their forces across the front, instead driving them into massive armored wedges. These wedges tore through Polish defenses, bypassing strong points and enveloping entire formations. At Piotrków, columns of panzers outflanked dug-in defenders, forcing rapid retreats. Motorized infantry followed, mopping up resistance in towns and villages. The pace was astonishing, with divisions advancing up to 40 kilometers in a single day. For Polish troops, accustomed to slower maneuver, the effect was devastating. Communications collapsed as German armor severed telephone lines and overran command posts. Isolated garrisons fought bravely, but found themselves surrounded with no hope of reinforcement. Civilians watched in horror as mechanized warfare turned their homeland into a battlefield. The speed of the panzer advance shocked the world, proving that maneuver could outpace numbers. Yet within this triumph lay the seeds of future overconfidence. Despite the campaign's rapid success, German tank crews experienced the brutal realities of combat. Mechanical breakdowns were frequent, especially among the light Panzer I until on models. Spare parts were scarce, and field workshops struggled to keep vehicles in running condition. Tank crews often drove for hours without rest, sleeping inside cramped, overheated steel hulls. Dust clogged engines, while rough terrain battered suspensions and tracks. In engagements with Polish cavalry, the panzers demonstrated their superiority, yet not without effort. At the Battle of Mokra, Polish horsemen armed with anti-tank rifles inflicted surprising damage. Several panzer columns stalled as hidden defenders ambushed them from forests. These moments reminded German commanders that armor was not invincible. They underscored the necessity of air support, reconnaissance, and artillery to neutralize threats. The myth of the unstoppable panzer was forged in Poland, but reality was far more complex. The machines were fragile. It was the doctrine that gave them strength. Coordination with the Luftwaffe emerged as a decisive element of Blitzkrieg in Poland. German aircraft, particularly the Stuka dive bomber, became the terror of the battlefield. Stukas attacked Polish columns with pinpoint accuracy, their sirens screaming as they dove from the sky. These strikes shattered morale, scattering infantry before the panzers arrived. In some cases, entire towns surrendered at the mere sight of German armor after bombardment. The Luftwaffe also provided reconnaissance, mapping Polish movements and guiding armored thrusts. This synergy gave the Panzer Divisions unmatched situational awareness compared to their foes. Polish commanders often found themselves reacting blindly, unable to counter the speed of combined attacks. Yet the campaign also exposed the risks of over-reliance on air support. When bad weather grounded aircraft, panzers advancing alone faced greater resistance. Nevertheless, the coordination of air and armor became the signature of German success. In Poland, this partnership showed its deadly potential. The campaign also revealed the value of encirclement tactics. Rather than destroying Polish units in direct battle, Panzer divisions sought to envelop and trap them. At Bzura, the largest battle of the campaign, German armor and motorized units encircled a massive Polish counterattack. The result was catastrophic for the defenders, who were cut off from supply and reinforcements. Entire divisions were captured, their soldiers forced into captivity. These encirclements destroyed the Polish army's ability to fight cohesively. Retreating units often found themselves surrounded once more, falling victim to relentless pursuit. It was not the strength of a single tank, but the momentum of the whole formation that achieved victory. Each encirclement was like a hammer blow against Poland's defenses, accelerating collapse. German generals marveled at the effectiveness of their doctrine, though some worried about overextension. Yet the speed of the victory seemed to justify every risk. The Panzer Division had proven its worth as an operational weapon. For the Polish population, the sight of panzers rumbling through their towns left an indelible mark. Civilians fled in terror, clogging roads and slowing their own army's retreat. Refugees became targets of strafing attacks by German aircraft, compounding the chaos. Villages burned as armored columns swept past, leaving ruin in their wake. For many Poles it seemed as if no defense could stand against this mechanized onslaught. Yet bravery persisted, as Polish soldiers mounted desperate defenses with limited resources. Anti-tank rifles and artillery occasionally halted German tanks long enough to buy time. Stories of these stands became legends, celebrated for their courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Still, the German advance was relentless, overwhelming resistance faster than it could regroup. In the eyes of the world, Poland fell with shocking speed, but within the chaos, lessons were being etched into the experience of German crews. They would carry those lessons into the campaigns to come. The conquest of Poland ended in just 5 weeks, shocking observers across Europe. For the German High Command, it seemed to validate everything they had hoped for in the Panzer Divisions. The armor had spearheaded the campaign, cutting deep into enemy territory and paralyzing defenses. Yet beneath the triumph lay stark warnings about equipment and sustainability. The light tanks were vulnerable, breakdowns were frequent, and supply lines strained under the speed of advance. These flaws were masked by Poland's relative weakness, but would prove deadly against stronger foes. German generals like Guderian noted these shortcomings, pressing for more powerful tanks and improved logistics. The campaign confirmed the brilliance of doctrine, but revealed the fragility of material. For Hitler, the victory emboldened his faith in Blitzkrieg as a decisive weapon. For the Allies, it was a wake-up call to modernize their armies. The baptism of fire was complete, and the Panzer Divisions had written themselves into history. But the war had only just begun. In the spring of 1940, the German High Command prepared for an audacious gamble against France, a nation still haunted by the bloodletting of World War I. The conventional expectation was that any attack would mirror 1914, driving through Belgium and clashing head-on with Allied armies. Yet within German ranks, General Erich von Manstein proposed something far bolder, something radical. His plan called for the main thrust to bypass the strongest defenses and strike through the Ardennes, a forested region considered impassable for modern armies. This area, lightly guarded by French forces, would become the spearhead of the Panzer Divisions. The tanks would pour through the forest, cross the Meuse River, and shatter the French line at Sedan. Once the breakthrough was achieved, the armoured spearheads would race westward to the English Channel, encircling the bulk of Allied armies in Belgium. It was a plan of daring simplicity and immense risk, relying on speed, deception, and the strength of mechanized warfare. Hitler approved it, trusting in the audacity of his generals and the capability of his panzers. This decision shifted the entire course of the war. In May 1940, The stage was set for the Blitzkrieg's most famous triumph. The German armoured force that rolled into the Low Countries was a blend of light and medium tanks, still dominated by Panzer Tis and EI. Around 2,500 tanks spearheaded the campaign, supported by motorized infantry, artillery and engineers. Once again, their numbers were less impressive than they seemed, with French and British forces fielding heavier and better armed tanks like the Char B1 and the Matilda. But it was not the quality of a single vehicle that determined the campaign's fate. It was the doctrine of concentration and mobility. The Panzers were not scattered piecemeal across the front, as the French often did, but massed into powerful divisions. Their commanders had trained for rapid maneuver, surprise and relentless exploitation of weakness. As the German infantry feinted into Belgium to draw Allied attention northward, the true hammer blow fell through the Ardennes. For days, long columns of tanks, trucks and artillery crawled along narrow forest roads, engines roaring under the canopy of trees. French commanders dismissed the possibility of a large-scale armoured thrust here, believing the terrain unsuitable. That miscalculation opened the door to catastrophe. Within days, the Panzers had emerged from the forest, ready to storm the Meuse. The trap was beginning to close. The crossing at Sedan became the pivotal moment of the campaign. On May 13, 1940, German units reached the banks of the Meuse, facing entrenched French defenders. The river was wide, its banks fortified, and artillery bristled on the high ground beyond. A direct assault seemed suicidal, yet the Germans prepared their most daring gamble. Luftwaffe Stukas bombarded the French positions with unrelenting ferocity, dropping hundreds of bombs in carefully coordinated waves. The psychological impact was devastating. Many French soldiers, unaccustomed to such concentrated air attack, broke and fled. Amid the chaos, German engineers rushed to construct pontoon bridges under fire, while infantry crossed in rubber boats. Once footholds were secured, the Panzers rumbled forward, crossing the river one after another. By evening, armoured units had penetrated deep into the French rear, creating panic and disarray. The supposedly impregnable Sedan line collapsed in a single day. The Blitzkrieg had carved open the gateway to France. Once the Meuse was crossed, the German armoured columns surged westward with breathtaking speed. Guderian's ex-Zydex Panzer Corps drove relentlessly toward the Channel coast, ignoring flank resistance and bypassing strongholds. Each day, the divisions advanced dozens of kilometers, cutting communication lines and isolating Allied units. French and British commanders struggled to comprehend the velocity of the German assault. Reports arrived too late, orders were delayed, and armoured breakthroughs outpaced even the fastest couriers. Town after town fell as panzers burst through, their speed preventing organized defense. Motorized infantry secured the ground behind, while supply convoys kept fuel and ammunition flowing. Luftwaffe aircraft hovered overhead, strafing retreating columns and adding to the terror. French tank units, when encountered, often fought bravely but were deployed too piecemeal to stop the tide. By May 20th, German tanks had reached Abbeville, cutting off the northern Allied armies from the rest of France. It was one of the greatest encirclements in military history. The Allies were trapped, and the noose tightened with each passing day. At Dunkirk, the consequences of Manstein's plan reached their climax. Hundreds of thousands of British and French troops were encircled on the beaches, pressed against the sea. The Panzers had delivered the encirclement envisioned by the architects of Blitzkrieg, yet here, hesitation altered the outcome. Hitler, influenced by Hermann Göring's promises that the Luftwaffe could finish the job, ordered a halt to the Panzers just short of annihilation. This pause gave the Allies the chance to organize Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force. Over 9 days, more than 300,000 troops escaped across the Channel under relentless air attack. For the Germans, it was a missed opportunity to crush Britain's fighting strength entirely. Still, the psychological impact of the Blitzkrieg in France was enormous. The fall of France in just 6 weeks stunned the world, toppling one of Europe's great powers. The Panzers had proven their worth as the spearhead of conquest, yet the seeds of future challenges were sown in those moments of hesitation and overconfidence. The success in France reshaped global perceptions of warfare. Observers saw armored thrusts supported by air power as the decisive formula of modern battle. Old doctrines of slow-moving infantry assaults seemed obsolete overnight. The French army, long regarded as the strongest in Europe, had crumbled with shocking speed. German propaganda celebrated the triumph of the Panzer Divisions, portraying them as an unstoppable force of steel and will. The term Blitzkrieg entered popular consciousness, symbolizing lightning war. In truth, the victory was as much about French miscalculations and rigid command structures as it was about German innovation. Still, the Panzers had executed their role with ruthless efficiency. For many German soldiers, the campaign confirmed their belief in destiny and superiority. For their enemies, it was a sobering lesson in the dangers of underestimating mechanized warfare. The world had witnessed a revolution in strategy. The Blitzkrieg was no longer theory, it was brutal reality. The experience in France also highlighted the strengths and weaknesses of German armored doctrine. Concentration of force, close air support, and rapid exploitation had worked to perfection. Yet logistical strains were evident, with fuel shortages slowing some advances. Mechanical breakdowns plagued the lighter tanks, forcing reliance on supply crews working day and night. The Allies, despite being overwhelmed, demonstrated that heavier tanks could resist German firepower if deployed correctly. Encounters with the British Matilda II revealed the vulnerability of panzer guns against thick armor. Only coordination with artillery and airstrikes allowed the Germans to neutralize such threats. These lessons would shape future demands for improved panzer models. At the same time, the morale of the armored troops soared after their stunning success. They had achieved in weeks what the Kaiser's armies had failed to achieve in years. The legend of the Panzer Divisions was cemented, yet war had a way of punishing hubris, and greater challenges loomed on the horizon. The fall of France in June 1940 marked the high point of German armored triumph. The Panzer Divisions had not only broken through at Sedan, but had redefined the possibilities of modern war. Their sweeping maneuvers encircled and destroyed entire armies, collapsing a great nation in weeks. The Blitzkrieg seemed invincible, an unstoppable force of steel, speed, and shock. Yet even in victory, cracks were visible to the discerning eye. Equipment limitations, supply challenges, and reliance on favorable conditions hinted at vulnerabilities. But for the moment, Germany basked in triumph. Hitler stood at the pinnacle of his power, convinced that his armored legions could conquer any foe. Europe lay at his feet, and the Allies reeled in dismay. For the Panzer Divisions, France was their masterpiece. The Blitzkrieg had been unleashed, and the world would never be the same. As the German Panzer Divisions carved their path of conquest across Europe, the tanks themselves became more than just weapons of war. They were transformed into symbols, icons of a new kind of conflict that seemed to defy the lessons of the past. Nazi propaganda seized upon their successes in Poland, France, and the Low Countries, shaping them into legends of unstoppable steel. Newsreels showed sleek armored columns moving in perfect formation, their treads crushing everything in their path. Photographers captured dramatic images of panzers cresting hills or smashing through villages, reinforcing the image of momentum and inevitability. For the German people, these images served as proof that Hitler's promises of renewed greatness were being fulfilled. The failures of World War I seemed forgotten as tanks became the embodiment of modern German strength. Every broadcast, every film reel, every newspaper headline hammered home the same message: the Panzers were invincible. Even the name Blitzkrieg became synonymous with speed, shock, and mechanized brilliance. The reality was far more complex, but the myth was powerful. It would take years of grinding battles to expose the truth behind the illusion. The Ministry of Propaganda, under Joseph Goebbels, understood the emotional impact of visual storytelling. In carefully edited newsreels, viewers saw tanks racing effortlessly across fields while enemy soldiers fled in panic. The brutal chaos of war was replaced with choreographed triumphs, where German technology appeared flawless. Cameras lingered on the faces of tank commanders, youthful and confident, framed as the new knights of a modern crusade. This imagery resonated deeply with a nation desperate for heroes, a people still scarred by the humiliation of Versailles. Even the roar of engines and the grinding of treads were amplified in theaters, designed to evoke awe and fear. Leaflets and illustrated magazines painted Panzers as both invulnerable shields and unstoppable swords. The myth was not simply for German audiences, but was aimed at the wider world. Foreign correspondents often echoed these impressions, reporting on the uncanny efficiency of German armor. The narrative reinforced Nazi prestige abroad, making potential enemies hesitate. Through this crafted spectacle, the Panzer myth grew into a global phenomenon. It blurred the line between battlefield reality and cinematic fantasy. At home, the psychological impact of the Panzer myth was immense. Civilians who once feared another drawn-out trench war were reassured by images of swift victories. The Panzers symbolized a new kind of war, efficient, scientific, and bloodless in appearance. Mothers believed their sons were fighting in machines too strong to be harmed, armored guardians who would surely return home victorious. The myth eased the pain of loss by portraying the war as quick and decisive. For children, toys and picture books turned tanks into objects of fascination and pride. The sight of Panzer models in parades reinforced the illusion of invulnerability. Even dissenters found it hard to counter the overwhelming narrative, as propaganda drowned out alternative voices. The illusion also soothed industrial workers who built the tanks, making them feel like participants in destiny. For the regime, the Panzer symbol became a unifying tool, linking factory floors to battlefront triumphs. The myth was carefully cultivated to inspire belief, even when harsh realities began to creep in. It was not just a story, it was a shield for morale. Abroad, the myth of German invincibility cast long shadows. Allied leaders and commanders were initially shaken by the speed of French collapse and the chaos inflicted by Panzer-led thrusts. Newspapers in London and Washington described the tanks as terrifying new machines, exaggerating their numbers and power. Cartoons often depicted them as monstrous juggernauts, unstoppable steel beasts that consumed everything in their path. Soldiers facing the Panzers for the first time carried this psychological burden, expecting to confront indestructible machines. This fear often magnified the effectiveness of the German advance, paralyzing resistance before shots were fired. In reality, German armor suffered breakdowns, fuel shortages, and battlefield losses, but these were rarely publicized. The Allies struggled to separate truth from spectacle, reinforcing the myth with their own anxieties. Even in the Soviet Union, early encounters with Panzer spearheads created an aura of dread. The belief in their supremacy often became a self-fulfilling prophecy as defenders faltered in the face of perceived inevitability. The Panzer myth thus became a weapon as potent as any shell or cannon. It turned fear into a force multiplier, shaping battles before they began. The myth was also deeply tied to Nazi ideology. Tanks were framed as the ultimate expression of Aryan ingenuity and Germanic strength. They were symbols of industrial might, fused with martial spirit, a fusion Hitler often praised in speeches. Propaganda posters showed panzers rolling across maps, accompanied by slogans of destiny and renewal. The Blitzkrieg was presented as proof of racial superiority, evidence that the German people were chosen to lead a new order. In this vision, tanks were not mere machines but embodiments of the regime's worldview. Even the designations Panzer Kampfwagen, armored fighting vehicle, were elevated with a mystique of technical superiority. Goebbels ensured that every victory reinforced this ideological message. Soldiers were depicted as heroic drivers of history's engine, while enemies were painted as weak and outdated. The myth fed into the grand narrative of inevitability. Germany could not lose because its machines and men were unmatched. Thus, the Panzer became not only a military icon, but also a cultural and political symbol of Nazi power. Its reputation stretched far beyond the battlefield, embedding itself in the psyche of a continent at war. Yet behind the polished propaganda lay a harsher reality. Many panzers were lightly armored, undergunned, and vulnerable to Allied heavy tanks and anti-tank weapons. Crews often relied on tactics and coordination, rather than raw machine superiority. Breakdowns were frequent and logistical strains left entire units stalled for lack of fuel or spare parts. Casualties among tank crews were mounting, but these figures were suppressed in German media. Even as victories in France dazzled the world, commanders knew the Panzer force was far from invincible. Still, these weaknesses were masked by the carefully controlled narrative. Rarely did the public see images of burning wrecks or retreating columns. The myth persisted because it was easier to believe in triumph than acknowledge vulnerability. Hitler himself bought into the legend, convinced that tanks could solve any strategic dilemma. This overconfidence would later contribute to catastrophic miscalculations. The Panzer myth, so carefully constructed, risked blinding even its creators. Illusion began to drift dangerously away from reality. The morale impact of the Panzer myth was twofold. It emboldened Germans while intimidating their foes. In factories and cities across the Reich, citizens cheered every newsreel showing columns of tanks. The image of steel rolling across conquered lands created a sense of unstoppable momentum. On the front lines, Allied soldiers often exaggerated German strength, believing they faced far more tanks than actually deployed. Reports from France suggested waves of panzers, when often only a handful had broken through. This psychological distortion worked in the Germans' favor, causing defenders to retreat prematurely or crumble under pressure. Fear magnified reality, making every German breakthrough seem larger than life. Meanwhile, German soldiers carried pride in belonging to the armored elite, convinced of their superiority. The myth thus reinforced fighting spirit within the Wehrmacht, even as hardships grew. Its power lay not in accuracy, but in belief. In this way, the Panzer became a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. It altered perception, which in war could decide victory or defeat. By 1940 and 1941, the Panzer myth had grown into one of the defining legends of the Second World War. It shaped strategy, influenced morale, and colored the perception of nations across continents. Tanks that were often mechanically flawed or tactically overstretched had been elevated into symbols of modern destiny. The myth fed upon itself, sustained by victories and amplified by propaganda. Yet as the war widened and new battlefields emerged, reality would begin to chip away at the illusion. The deserts of North Africa, the vast steppes of the Soviet Union, and the skies filled with Allied bombers would test the Panzers in ways propaganda could not conceal. Still, the legend endured, even in the face of setbacks. For many, the image of the Panzer was larger than life, a steel embodiment of Germany's wartime ambition. It was a myth that inspired both awe and terror, reshaping the psychology of war itself. But myths, no matter how powerful, eventually confront reality, and in the years ahead, the Panzer legend would be tested to its breaking point. When the Panzer Divisions crossed into the deserts of North Africa in 1941, they entered one of the most unusual battlegrounds of the Second World War. Hitler had dispatched them reluctantly, more as a political gesture to support Mussolini's faltering Italian army than as part of a grand strategy. Yet what began as a limited expedition quickly became a defining theatre of mechanized warfare. The Afrika Korps, commanded by General Erwin Rommel, was small in number but dynamic in spirit. With a handful of Panzer Divisions primarily equipped with Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, Rommel transformed the flat, unforgiving desert into a stage for armoured manoeuvre. The desert itself posed immense challenges, with supply lines stretching hundreds of miles over hostile terrain. Sand-clogged engines destroyed filters and slowed advances, yet it also offered open horizons perfect for fast-moving armoured thrusts. Rommel recognized this potential, turning the desert into a chessboard where tanks became queens and pawns in a deadly game. His early victories stunned both the Italians and the British, who underestimated his audacity. The North African campaign became synonymous with rapid movements, surprise attacks, and the legend of the Desert Fox. Yet behind the brilliance lay constant strain, especially in keeping panzers supplied with fuel, water, and spare parts. Rommel's leadership defined the reputation of the Panzer Divisions in North Africa. He earned the nickname the Desert Fox, not merely for his cunning, but for his instinctive grasp of armoured warfare in the desert's vast spaces. Using tactics that mirrored Blitzkrieg in Europe, Rommel employed speed, deception, and surprise to keep the British perpetually off balance. He often led from the front, personally scouting positions and directing maneuvers, inspiring his men with courage and charisma. His habit of striking where least expected earned his 7th Panzer Division in France the name the Ghost Division, and in Africa, that reputation only grew. British commanders often found themselves guessing where Rommel's panzers would appear next. Reports of German armour moving impossibly fast across the sands fed his legend and demoralized his enemies. Yet Rommel's boldness came at a cost, stretching his forces thin and relying on daring rather than secure logistics. Panzer crews endured long marches under searing heat, their tanks breaking down as much from climate as combat. Still, under Rommel's command, the Afrika Korps became a symbol of German tactical brilliance. His fame transcended Germany, with even British newspapers admiring his skill. In the desert, Rommel crafted both victory and myth. The Afrika Korps battles showcased both the strengths and weaknesses of German armoured doctrine. In early clashes, such as at Gazala and Tobruk, the Panzer Divisions proved highly effective in mobile warfare. They excelled in rapid encirclements, cutting off British units and forcing retreats. Their coordination between tanks, artillery, and reconnaissance gave them an edge over the often slower British armour. Yet the Panzer Divisions were not invincible. British tanks, like the Matilda II, and later the American-made Grant and Sherman, began to challenge German superiority. German gunners and panzer crews had to adapt, using superior training and tactics to offset inferior numbers. Desert fighting exposed weaknesses in German supply systems, as fuel shortages repeatedly halted otherwise successful advances. Panzers that outmaneuvered the enemy could not function without petrol delivered across the Mediterranean under constant Allied naval and air attack. Despite these constraints, the Panzer Divisions fought with relentless efficiency, winning admiration even from their adversaries. Their success stemmed from tactical ingenuity rather than overwhelming firepower. Rommel's men made the most of limited resources in a theatre defined by scarcity. The desert was as much their enemy as the British Eighth Army. The campaign was, above all, a war of logistics. Tanks that dominated the battlefield were useless without steady supplies of fuel, ammunition, and water. Every panzer advance depended on convoys of vulnerable trucks crawling across the desert. The British, with control of the sea routes, repeatedly struck at Axis supply lines. Malta, the island fortress, served as a critical Allied base for disrupting German shipping. Convoys meant to replenish Rommel's panzers were often sunk before reaching Africa. As a result, Panzer Divisions frequently fought with barely enough fuel to sustain operations. Crews sometimes had to abandon tanks in the desert for lack of petrol. Rommel's daring often masked these shortages, but the strain grew with each campaign. The Afrika Korps fought brilliantly but always on the edge of collapse. The balance between tactical brilliance and logistical desperation defined the Panzer experience in North Africa. It was a theatre where genius clashed with harsh realities, and no matter how daring the maneuver, the desert demanded a heavy price. The battles in North Africa showcased maneuver warfare at its most dramatic. Open deserts allowed sweeping tank engagements reminiscent of cavalry charges where speed and positioning were decisive. At battles like Gazala and El Alamein, entire divisions clashed in vast arcs of movement. Panzers sought to outflank British armour, while the British sought to blunt German thrusts with minefields and artillery. Rommel often used feints, luring the enemy into traps, before striking with concentrated panzer forces. These maneuvers kept his legend alive, even when numbers were against him. Yet over time, the British adapted, developing better coordination between infantry, armour, and air power. The arrival of American supplies through Lend-Lease gave the Allies superior numbers of tanks and trucks. Gradually the tide of battle shifted against the Germans. The myth of Rommel's Ghost Division persisted, but the reality grew harsher with every engagement. Superior Allied resources and growing air dominance slowly ground down the Afrika Korps. By 1943, the Desert War had turned into a slow retreat. The days of panzer dominance in Africa were numbered. Despite setbacks, Rommel's use of panzers in North Africa left a powerful legacy. His mastery of maneuver warfare became a case study in military academies around the world. Generals admired his ability to read terrain, exploit surprise, and use limited forces to maximum effect. Even when outnumbered, his panzers often achieved local superiority through speed and daring. His reputation as a commander of integrity also set him apart from many Nazi leaders. He was respected not only for his skill, but for his treatment of prisoners and refusal to commit atrocities in Africa. This reputation further enhanced the legend of the Desert Fox. For his soldiers, the Panzer became not just a machine, but a symbol of tactical brilliance and ingenuity. The Afrika Korps became a name spoken with pride among German veterans. In the desert sands, the myth of German armoured invincibility was both reinforced and challenged. The war in North Africa was a crucible that tested the limits of Blitzkrieg. It was here that the Panzer Divisions wrote some of their most dramatic chapters, and it was here that they began to face the inevitability of defeat. By late 1942, the balance shifted decisively with the Second Battle of El Alamein. British forces under General Bernard Montgomery amassed overwhelming superiority in men, tanks, and air support. Despite Rommel's tactical genius, the Afrika Korps could not withstand such pressure. The Panzers fought valiantly, counterattacking again and again, but were steadily pushed back. The long retreat across Libya and into Tunisia marked the slow death of the German armoured presence in Africa. Shortages of fuel and parts reduced once proud divisions to scattered remnants. The desert, which had once been Rommel's ally, now became a vast trap from which there was no escape. By May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered, marking the end of the campaign. For the Panzer Divisions, it was both a heroic saga and a tragic collapse. They had achieved extraordinary feats, but could not overcome material realities. The North African campaign proved that brilliance alone could not substitute for resources. It revealed the limits of the Panzer legend, and it underscored the growing strength of the Allied war machine. The legacy of the Panzer Divisions in North Africa endures as one of the most dramatic episodes of the Second World War. Rommel's campaigns demonstrated the potential of armoured warfare in open terrain. His tactics influenced generations of military leaders, shaping doctrine long after the war ended. Yet they also revealed the fragility of operations built on daring without supply. The Ghost Division's legend was built on speed, surprise, and audacity, but its fate was sealed by fuel shortages and Allied production. In the deserts of Africa, the Panzer Divisions earned respect from friend and foe alike. Their struggle embodied both the brilliance and the limitations of Blitzkrieg. They showed that machines could be mighty, but without fuel they were helpless. They proved that leadership could inspire miracles, but could not change the laws of logistics. The sands of North Africa buried both triumph and tragedy for the Panzers. From the dust, their reputation emerged both magnified and questioned. And as the desert winds faded, the Panzer myth rolled eastward, toward the colossal battles of the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, the largest land invasion in history was unleashed as Hitler's Wehrmacht stormed into the Soviet Union under the codename Operation Barbarossa. At the forefront of this massive assault were the Panzer Divisions, tasked with spearheading breakthroughs and encircling vast numbers of Red Army forces. Three great army groups, North, Center, and South, swept across an 800-mile front with a staggering force of nearly 3 million men and thousands of tanks. The German plan relied heavily on speed, with the Panzer spearheads driving deep into Soviet territory to create vast encirclements. In those early weeks, the Panzers achieved stunning successes, slicing through unprepared defenses with devastating precision. The battles at Minsk and Białystok saw hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops surrounded and captured in record time. German commanders believed they had delivered decisive blows that would collapse Soviet resistance within months. The Soviet Union, however, proved far more resilient than anticipated, with reserves pouring forward and defenses stiffening after initial shock. The sheer size of the country presented challenges of distance and logistics never before encountered by the Panzer Arm. Yet in the first weeks, the momentum appeared unstoppable, and the Panzer Division stood at the pinnacle of their power. The Battle of Minsk in late June 1941 exemplified the ferocity and effectiveness of German armoured tactics in the opening stages of Barbarossa. Panzers from Army Group Center encircled 4 Soviet armies in a colossal pincer movement that trapped more than 300,000 men. Soviet divisions, cut off from retreat and supply, were annihilated in pockets that were crushed by relentless German armor and artillery. The swiftness of the encirclement shocked the Red Army, which struggled to mount coherent counterattacks against the rapidly moving panzers. German crews, flushed with victory, believed the campaign might indeed end within weeks. The success at Minsk opened the road to Smolensk, where another titanic encirclement awaited. For the Wehrmacht, these early battles seemed to validate Blitzkrieg as the supreme form of modern warfare. The Panzer Divisions operated with an efficiency that combined speed, surprise, and overwhelming tactical coordination. Yet each victory masked growing strain as vehicles consumed fuel at alarming rates and supply lines stretched thin. Despite these issues, the early summer of 1941 was a period of unprecedented triumph for German armor. Soviet losses in men and material reached catastrophic levels. But even as the panzers surged forward, the vastness of Russia loomed as an unseen adversary. At Smolensk in July 1941, the Panzer Divisions again executed vast encirclements that netted nearly 180,000 Soviet prisoners. The battle demonstrated the extraordinary mobility of German armor, which was capable of closing giant pockets across broad expanses of terrain. Soviet forces, though battered, displayed increasing determination, launching counterattacks that surprised German commanders with their ferocity. Tank battles erupted in fields and forests, with Soviet T-34s making their first significant appearances. The T-34, with its sloped armor and powerful 76 mm gun, shocked German tank crews who found their weapons often ineffective against it. Although the numbers were still limited, the encounter hinted at the formidable challenges that lay ahead. German commanders adapted by using combined firepower, artillery, anti-tank guns, and coordinated attacks to blunt the Soviet machines. Smolensk delayed the timetable for the march on Moscow, buying the Red Army precious time. The battle highlighted the paradox of Barbarossa, tactical brilliance paired with strategic overreach. The Panzer Divisions could crush Soviet formations, but the Soviet Union had manpower and territory on a scale far beyond German expectations. Each victory carried the seeds of delay, exhaustion, and attrition. Further south, at Kiev in September 1941, the Panzer Divisions achieved one of the greatest encirclements in military history. By combining armored thrusts from Army Group Center and Army Group South, the Germans surrounded over 600,000 Soviet troops in a vast pocket. The scale of the operation was unprecedented, with entire Soviet armies swallowed by the relentless advance of German tanks and motorized units. German commanders hailed it as a masterpiece of maneuver warfare, a demonstration of the Panzer's devastating power when unleashed in mass. Soviet resistance was fierce but fragmented, with many units fighting desperately before succumbing to overwhelming German pressure. The destruction of the Kiev pocket removed much of the Soviet southwestern front, clearing the way to the Dnieper and beyond. Yet the victory also delayed the planned assault on Moscow, as valuable panzer formations were diverted south to achieve the encirclement. Hitler's insistence on securing Ukraine before striking at the Soviet capital contributed to the fateful postponement of the Moscow offensive. For the Panzer Divisions, the battle was both a triumph and a burden, adding to their already strained machines and weary crews. Kiev epitomized the stunning capabilities of Blitzkrieg, but also the dangerous consequences of Hitler's shifting priorities. The geography of the Soviet Union introduced challenges that German planners had underestimated. The vast distances between objectives meant that panzers often outran their supply lines. Fuel convoys struggled to keep pace, leaving tanks stranded in fields when petrol ran dry. The primitive road network, often little more than dirt tracks, turned into quagmires after summer rains. Dust clogged engines, while bridges frequently collapsed under the weight of armored columns. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep tanks operational, cannibalizing parts from damaged vehicles. Each kilometer gained stretched logistics thinner, forcing improvisation and slowing advances. The Red Army, meanwhile, retreated deeper into its vast hinterlands, trading space for time. Soviet railways facilitated rapid movement of reinforcements, while scorched earth tactics denied the Germans local resources. Panzer crews began to sense that they were fighting not just the Soviet army, but the land itself. The very expanses that enabled sweeping encirclements also drained German strength. Despite their victories, the Panzers were caught in a war of exhaustion. What seemed a sprint in June became an endless marathon by autumn. The terrain itself became a silent but relentless opponent. Soviet resilience was another factor the Panzer Divisions had not anticipated. Despite catastrophic losses, the Red Army refused to collapse. New units were raised with astonishing speed, often thrown into battle with minimal training. Soviet commanders learned quickly from early disasters, adapting tactics and reinforcing defenses around key cities. Counterattacks, though costly, disrupted German timetables and forced the Panzers into defensive actions. Civilians were mobilized for the war effort, building fortifications and supporting logistical networks. The German expectation of a Soviet collapse within months proved disastrously optimistic. Each destroyed army seemed to be replaced by another, drawn from the seemingly limitless manpower of the Soviet Union. The myth of German invincibility began to crack as Soviet morale hardened. Propaganda emphasized the defense of the motherland, galvanizing soldiers and civilians alike. By autumn, the Germans faced an opponent that was bloodied but unbroken. For the Panzer Divisions, it meant a campaign that grew more grueling with each passing day. Victory was no longer assured, only fought for at immense cost. The strain on Panzer crews was immense during the first months of Barbarossa. Soldiers endured endless marches, often fighting one day and advancing hundreds of kilometers the next. Sleep was scarce, food was rationed, and mechanical breakdowns were constant. The heat of summer turned tank interiors into ovens, while swarms of insects tormented exhausted crews. Despite these hardships, morale remained high during the early victories, buoyed by the belief that final triumph was near. Tankers decorated their machines with kill markings, proud of their role in the conquest of the East. Yet, as the weeks dragged on, fatigue grew unbearable. The vast encirclements, while tactically brilliant, required relentless effort to seal and destroy. Soviet resistance in the pockets was stubborn, forcing prolonged fighting in harsh conditions. German soldiers began to realize that this was not the quick war of 1940, but a titanic struggle without end in sight. The psychological toll was as heavy as the physical strain. The legend of Blitzkrieg was being tested in a crucible unlike any before. By the autumn of 1941, the Panzer Division stood deep inside Soviet territory, yet the decisive victory remained elusive. Encirclements at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev destroyed vast Soviet forces, but the Red Army endured, refusing to collapse. The challenges of distance, logistics, and terrain gnawed at the efficiency of German armor. Hitler's shifting strategic priorities delayed critical advances, compounding the difficulties faced by frontline troops. Panzer divisions were increasingly forced to fight not only the Red Army, but also the exhaustion of their own men and machines. The belief in a short campaign evaporated as October rains turned roads into rivers of mud, halting armored movement entirely. The dream of reaching Moscow before winter faded, replaced by grim determination to hold gains. Barbarossa revealed the brilliance of German armored tactics, but also their limitations when stretched across the immensity of the Soviet Union. What began as a campaign of lightning war became a grinding struggle of attrition. The Panzer divisions had achieved feats of unprecedented scale, but the decisive blow remained out of reach. The Soviet Union had survived the storm, and the struggle on the Eastern Front was only beginning. By December 1941, the German Panzer divisions had reached the very gates of Moscow, yet their momentum collapsed under the crushing weight of the Russian winter. Hitler had promised his soldiers that the campaign would be over before snow fell, leaving them woefully unprepared for temperatures plunging to -30 and even -40 degrees Celsius. Crews wore thin uniforms, often little more than summer tunics and scarves improvised from rags, while their Soviet adversaries fought in fur-lined coats and felt boots. The biting wind froze exposed flesh within minutes, leaving German soldiers with frostbite and amputations on a scale unseen before. Mechanical failures became routine, as oil congealed into sludge and engines refused to start without fires lit beneath them. Tanks that had spearheaded encirclements now lay immobile, their tracks locked solid with ice. Machine guns jammed, rifles misfired, and radio batteries died in the bitter cold. Men huddled in burning barns or dugouts, fighting for warmth as much as against the enemy. The dream of a quick war had disintegrated into the nightmare of survival against nature itself. The Panzer Divisions, once symbols of speed and power, stood paralyzed by snow, frost, and exhaustion. Winter had become the Red Army's most powerful ally. The mechanical failures that plagued the Panzers in this first Russian winter revealed the vulnerabilities of German engineering under extreme conditions. Precision-machined engines that had performed flawlessly in France and the Balkans seized up when lubricants thickened in sub-zero weather. Crews attempted desperate improvisations, heating crankcases with open flames or draining oil at night to keep it warm inside barracks. Tracks froze to the ground, forcing soldiers to hammer them loose before any movement could begin. Fuel supplies dwindled as supply convoys collapsed on impassable roads turned into frozen ruts. In contrast, Soviet T-34 tanks proved far more reliable, designed with wide tracks and simple systems that endured the brutal climate. German officers were stunned to watch Soviet armor maneuver in snow that immobilized their own machines. Panzer crews often had to abandon tanks temporarily, leaving them vulnerable to Soviet capture or destruction. The gap in winter preparedness created a stark imbalance, nullifying the tactical superiority German armor had enjoyed in the summer. For the first time, the myth of the invincible Panzer was shattered not by enemy guns but by ice and snow. The winter revealed that Blitzkrieg had a fatal weakness. It could not sustain itself in endless frozen landscapes. The psychological strain of winter was as devastating as the physical challenges. German soldiers who had advanced with confidence now endured weeks of bitter stagnation, living in primitive conditions with little shelter. Frostbite claimed thousands of men. With toes and fingers blackened beyond saving, entire units became incapacitated, not through combat losses, but through exposure. Ammunition froze in belts, artillery shells cracked, and the very weapons of war seemed to betray their operators. The morale of the Panzer Divisions, once riding high on a wave of victories, crumbled as Moscow remained beyond reach. Soviet propaganda exploited the suffering, broadcasting taunts about Hitler's frozen army and spreading leaflets that mocked the Germans' plight. Soldiers began to question the promises of their leaders, realizing that they had been sent into a campaign without proper winter equipment. Letters home revealed despair, hunger, and a longing for an end to the misery. The once proud armored spearheads were reduced to static defensive forces, barely holding lines against Soviet counterattacks. The fighting spirit endured, but the aura of invincibility had been stripped away. Winter had exposed the fragility of the German war machine at its very core. The Red Army seized the moment, launching counteroffensives in December 1941 that stunned the exhausted Panzer Divisions. Soviet forces, supported by Siberian troops trained and equipped for winter combat, struck with ferocity along the Moscow front. Sieg troops glided through snowdrifts to infiltrate German positions, while T-34 tanks exploited the frozen ground to maneuver where Panzers could not. German armor, immobilized by cold, was forced into desperate defensive battles, often relying on infantry and makeshift strongpoints to stem the tide. Entire panzer regiments were thrown into holding actions, their tanks firing from static positions more like bunkers than mobile weapons. The Soviets pushed the Germans back from the capital, inflicting the first great strategic setback of the entire war for Hitler's armies. Panic spread through the ranks as rumors of encirclements and breakthroughs multiplied. Yet discipline, though frayed, managed to hold just enough to prevent complete collapse. Commanders ordered retreat only grudgingly, forbidden by Hitler's stand-fast orders. The winter crisis thus became not only a test of endurance but of obedience under impossible conditions. The Panzer Divisions were bleeding, but they refused to disintegrate entirely. Inside the Panzer crews themselves, survival required extraordinary resilience and improvisation. Soldiers stripped homes and villages of anything that could provide warmth, from blankets to furniture used as firewood. Engines were run continuously to prevent freezing, wasting precious fuel that was already in short supply. Meals consisted of frozen bread, hacked into chunks with axes, and thin soups boiled over scavenged fires. Tank crews slept inside their vehicles, wrapped in whatever cloth they could find, breathing clouds of vapor into icy steel interiors. Frost coated the insides of hatches, turning every touch into agony. Medical care was overwhelmed, with frostbite cases filling field hospitals that lacked even basic supplies. Men prayed not only for victory, but simply for survival, until spring. Letters begged families back home to send wool socks, gloves, or even candles, though few ever arrived. Discipline and camaraderie kept units functioning, as men depended utterly on one another to endure. The Panzer force, once a cutting-edge instrument of conquest, was reduced to a community of frozen survivors. Against both enemy and climate, they fought an unequal battle that seemed endless. Strategically, the winter of 1941-42 marked a turning point that German commanders would never forget. The failure to capture Moscow before the freeze revealed the limits of Blitzkrieg when confronted with vast distances and climatic extremes. Hitler's refusal to allow tactical withdrawals trapped Panzer Divisions in positions that became untenable. Supply systems collapsed entirely, with horse-drawn wagons supplementing fuel and ammunition in a supposedly modern mechanized army. The lesson was clear. Germany had underestimated the Soviet Union not only militarily, but geographically and environmentally. Yet rather than adapt rationally, Hitler insisted that sheer willpower could overcome nature. His orders condemned the Panzer Divisions to unnecessary suffering and attrition. German commanders began to doubt the wisdom of the Führer's strategy, recognizing the impossibility of victory under such conditions. The winter crisis planted seeds of disillusionment even among hardened veterans. Blitzkrieg, which had dazzled Europe, had struck the immovable wall of Russia's winter. It was a warning that this war would not be won quickly or easily. The Panzer Divisions carried the scars of that first winter into every subsequent campaign. For the Soviets, the winter crisis was a validation of their endurance and a rallying cry for greater resistance. Propaganda celebrated the general winter that had once saved Russia against Napoleon and now humbled Hitler. Soviet citizens took pride in their ability to withstand conditions that shattered the enemy. The image of T-34s prowling snowy fields became a symbol of resilience and technological superiority. German soldiers, once feared across Europe, were depicted as helpless and broken in the snowdrifts outside Moscow. This shift in perception strengthened morale across the Soviet Union, convincing many that ultimate victory was possible. For the Panzer Divisions, this meant facing an opponent whose confidence had been renewed. Each Soviet counterattack carried not just military force, but the psychological weight of a nation rising from apparent ruin. The German aura of inevitability had been pierced forever. From this winter onward, every campaign carried the memory of failure. The Wehrmacht would never again enjoy the same aura of unstoppable conquest it had wielded in 1940 and 1941. The winter crisis reshaped the entire trajectory of the Eastern Front. By the spring of 1942, the Panzer Divisions emerged from the winter crisis, battered but not destroyed. Thousands of vehicles had been lost to mechanical failure or abandonment, and entire units had been reduced to fragments of their former strength. Yet German resilience, discipline, and ingenuity allowed them to recover, repair, and prepare for renewed offensives. Lessons were grudgingly learned, better lubricants were introduced, clothing was improved, and tactics adjusted for prolonged campaigns. But the memory of that winter haunted every soldier who endured it, a reminder of how close the Wehrmacht had come to collapse. For many, it was the moment they realized the war in the East was unlike any other in history. The Panzer Divisions had survived, but they no longer marched with the same confidence of 1941. Their future campaigns would be colored by the memory of snowbound tanks and frozen comrades. The myth of invincibility had died in the fields outside Moscow. The winter of 1941-42 was not just a season, it was a verdict on Germany's overreach. From then on, the Eastern Front would be a battle not just of armies, but of endurance itself. In the summer of 1942, Hitler turned his gaze to the Volga River, convinced that capturing Stalingrad would cripple Soviet industry and morale. The Panzer Divisions, rebuilt after the winter debacle, were once again placed at the heart of the offensive. Spearheading Operation Blue, armored formations surged across the steppe, driving deep into southern Russia with speed and precision. German propaganda promised a swift victory, boasting that the Panzers would roll triumphantly into the city named after Stalin himself. Yet, as they approached Stalingrad's industrial skyline, the terrain shifted from open fields to an urban labyrinth of factories, rubble and narrow alleys. Tanks designed for maneuver warfare suddenly found themselves in a battlefield of brick, steel, and shattered glass. Soviet defenders transformed every building into a fortress, every street into a kill zone. The Volga flowed like a lifeline behind them, supplying reinforcements and ammunition despite relentless German bombardment. For the first time, the Panzers were not hunting across open plains, but crawling into a furnace of urban resistance. What was meant to be a swift strike now became a grinding battle of attrition. The city would soon devour entire divisions in its cauldron of fire and blood. The Panzer crews quickly discovered that their steel behemoths, so dominant on open terrain, were ill-suited to the ruins of Stalingrad. Tanks struggled to maneuver in streets choked with debris, their long guns unable to traverse in the narrow confines of alleyways. Soviet infantry, armed with Molotov cocktails and anti-tank rifles, emerged from cellars and sewers to strike at vulnerable flanks. Snipers positioned in upper stories turned intersections into deadly traps, forcing German crews to advance blindly. The Panzers became both predators and prey, firing into shattered factories only to be ambushed by hidden defenders. Often tanks were reduced to supporting roles, blasting strongpoints so infantry could advance, rather than driving deep thrusts into enemy lines. Crews suffered immense stress, knowing every corner could conceal a threat. Damage repair became nearly impossible, as crippled vehicles were abandoned amidst the rubble. Fuel and ammunition shortages grew severe, with convoys targeted by Soviet artillery from across the river. The myth of German mechanized invincibility faltered as the city swallowed panzer after panzer. Stalingrad was proving itself a graveyard for steel as much as for men. Despite these challenges, German command continued to pour panzers into the inferno, believing their firepower could eventually break Soviet resistance. The armored divisions fought in fragmented groups, supporting infantry battalions inching forward through factories like the Red October Steelworks and the Barricade plant. Tanks blasted walls open to clear paths, but each breakthrough dissolved into another ambush. Soviet defenders showed astonishing resilience, replacing fallen comrades within hours as reinforcements ferried across the Volga at night. The Panzers fired thousands of shells, reducing entire districts to smoldering ruins, yet the enemy always seemed to emerge from the rubble. Urban combat transformed into a battle measured not in miles, but in meters. Crews became exhausted, fighting continuously with little rest, their machines running hot and worn. Maintenance teams worked in basements under shell fire, cannibalizing wrecks for spare parts. Fuel drums were rolled by hand through ruins just to keep tanks moving. For all their might, the Panzer Divisions were being consumed by the grinding pace of the battle. The strategy that had conquered France collapsed against the stubborn brick and blood of Stalingrad. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army, along with its attached Panzer Divisions, held much of Stalingrad, but they were dangerously overstretched. The armored spearheads were scattered across rubble-strewn districts, cut off from one another by Soviet strongpoints. While German command obsessed over the symbolic capture of the city, the Soviets prepared a massive counterstroke. Operation Uranus, launched on November 19th, struck not at the Panzer Divisions within Stalingrad, but at their weaker Romanian and Hungarian allies guarding the flanks. Soviet armored spearheads smashed through these positions with overwhelming force, encircling the entire Sixth Army in a vast pocket. The German panzers trapped inside suddenly shifted from attackers to besieged defenders. Fuel reserves dwindled, and ammunition ran dangerously low as the Soviets tightened the noose. Hitler forbade any breakout, insisting that the army hold its ground until relief arrived. For the panzer crews, the Cauldron of Stalingrad had become both a prison and a death sentence. The steel that once drove conquest now lay encircled in a tightening grip of fire. Inside the encirclement, the Panzer Divisions faced shortages that crippled their effectiveness. Tanks that had once spearheaded assaults were immobilized, either from lack of fuel or from mechanical breakdowns in the freezing cold. Crews dismantled wrecks to salvage parts, desperately trying to keep a handful of vehicles operational. Ammunition was rationed to the last shell, forcing tanks to conserve fire even during Soviet assaults. Food grew scarce, and soldiers boiled horse carcasses for sustenance as rations dwindled. Frostbite and disease spread, echoing the nightmare of the previous winter. Supply drops by Luftwaffe aircraft provided only a fraction of what was needed, and many planes were destroyed by Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Panzer crews watched as their machines froze solid in the snow, unable to move or fight. Morale collapsed, with men realizing they were abandoned in the ruins of a city turned to ash. The mighty Panzer Divisions, once symbols of Blitzkrieg, had become skeletal remnants surrounded by an unyielding enemy. The Cauldron of Stalingrad was consuming them whole. The Soviet counteroffensive closed tighter with each passing week, crushing resistance and overwhelming isolated German strongholds. Panzer units, which had once coordinated sweeping maneuvers, now fought in desperate fragmented actions, reduced to protecting small perimeters of rubble. Tanks were dug into the ground as stationary gun platforms, firing until destroyed. Soviet artillery pounded them relentlessly, and every attempt at counterattack collapsed under superior numbers. Operation Winter Storm, a German relief attempt, briefly raised hope, but never reached the trapped divisions. Stalin's armies pressed mercilessly, tightening the circle until escape became impossible. German soldiers listened to radio broadcasts, promising salvation, but none came. The Panzers, symbols of German might, were reduced to burnt-out hulks scattered across the city. Every day brought new surrenders, mass casualties, and scenes of despair. The myth of mechanized dominance ended in the rubble of Stalingrad, buried beneath the snow and ruins. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was collapsing in starvation, exhaustion, and hopelessness. Panzer units, once the cutting edge of German military power, were unrecognizable shadows of themselves. Out of hundreds of tanks deployed, only a handful remained operational, their crews clinging to survival rather than victory. Soviet forces tightened their grip relentlessly. Block by block, building by building, surrender became inevitable, though Hitler continued to demand resistance to the last bullet. On January 31st, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered the southern pocket, and within days the northern sector also fell. The once proud Panzer Divisions, symbols of lightning war, were ground into nothing by urban warfare and Soviet encirclement. Tens of thousands of German prisoners were marched into captivity, many never to return. Among the frozen ruins, wrecked tanks stood as silent memorials to the hubris of overextension. Stalingrad was not just a defeat, it was a catastrophe of world historical scale. The Panzer Divisions had been broken in both body and myth. The destruction of the Panzer Divisions at Stalingrad marked a turning point in the entire war. For the first time, Germany had not only failed to achieve its objectives, but had suffered a colossal defeat from which it could never fully recover. The loss of experienced panzer crews was irreplaceable, and the shattered armored strength weakened German operations across the Eastern Front. The Soviets, emboldened by victory, seized the initiative that would carry them westward in relentless offensives. Hitler's insistence on holding Stalingrad at all costs doomed his finest troops and exposed the limits of his strategy. The Panzers, designed for swift maneuver, had been destroyed in a battle that nullified every advantage they possessed. The lessons of the Cauldron were clear. Tanks could not win wars alone, and urban warfare was their graveyard. Survivors carried the scars of hunger, frost, and despair for the rest of their lives. For Germany, Stalingrad symbolized the beginning of the end. For the world, it was proof that even the mightiest machines could be broken in the crucible of total war. When the German invasion of the Soviet Union began in June 1941, the Wehrmacht believed its panzer divisions were unmatched in speed, training, and tactical coordination. Yet as the panzers advanced across the steppe, they encountered a shock that reverberated through the German high command. Soviet forces deployed a new tank, the T-34, which combined sloped armor, mobility, and firepower in a way the Germans had not anticipated. Its 76.2 mm gun could penetrate the armor of Panzer III and Iver tanks at ranges where German shells often bounced harmlessly. Its sloped armor, revolutionary at the time, deflected shots that would have destroyed any earlier tank. Wide tracks allowed it to maneuver in mud and snow far better than its German counterparts, reducing the mechanical breakdowns that plagued panzer columns in harsh conditions. Crews marveled at its ability to withstand punishment while striking back with lethal force. Reports flowed back to Berlin, describing the T-34 as a nightmare opponent. For the first time since the Blitzkrieg began, German tank crews realized their machines no longer dominated the battlefield. The arrival of the T-34 forced the Reich to rethink its armored doctrine. A new phase of the tank war was beginning, one that would escalate into a full-scale arms race. The T-34's design represented a triumph of Soviet pragmatism and industrial foresight. Unlike German tanks, which often emphasized precision engineering, the T-34 was built for mass production, simplicity, and rugged performance. Factories could assemble thousands of them with fewer resources, ensuring a constant flow of replacements despite catastrophic losses. Its diesel engine reduced the risk of fire, a constant danger in gasoline-powered German tanks. Sloped armor meant Soviet designers achieved effective protection without making the vehicle excessively heavy, maintaining speed and maneuverability. For German crews, encounters with T-34 often ended in frustration, as Panzer rounds ricocheted harmlessly while Soviet shells punched through German armor. Field commanders warned that existing Panzer models were becoming obsolete. Heinz Guderian, the architect of Panzer doctrine, sounded the alarm to Hitler and the High Command, insisting that Germany required new tanks to counter the Soviet advantage. The T-34 was not just a weapon, but a symbol of industrial willpower. It showed that mass production and functional design could outperform precision engineering in total war. Its presence on the battlefield changed everything, forcing Germany into a desperate race to catch up. The immediate German response was to improve the Panzer III and IV, the backbone of their armored divisions in 1941 and 1942. The Panzer III, once effective in Poland and France, was quickly upgraded with a longer-barreled 50 mm gun, but even this proved insufficient against the T-34. The Panzer IV underwent a more significant transformation, receiving the long 75 mm Kursk 40 gun, capable of penetrating the T-34's armor at greater distances. Additional armor plates were welded to its hull and turret, giving it a fighting chance against Soviet adversaries. These modifications allowed the Panzer IV to remain relevant deep into the war, becoming the workhorse of the German armored force. However, each improvement added weight, reducing mobility and straining engines and transmissions. German crews recognized that even with upgrades, they were fighting an uphill battle against the sheer numbers of T-34 pouring onto the front. Production could not keep pace, as German factories built tanks with painstaking craftsmanship instead of mass output. Thus, while Panzer Divisions adapted to survive, the balance of quantity increasingly favored the Soviets. The arms race was intensifying, and Germany was already falling behind. In 1942, Hitler ordered the development of entirely new tanks to restore German superiority. The result was the Tiger Res, a massive, heavily armored machine, mounting the fearsome 88 mm Kursk 36 gun. This weapon could destroy T-34s and even heavier Soviet tanks at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers, giving German crews a decisive advantage in firepower. The Tiger's thick frontal armor rendered it nearly invulnerable to Soviet guns in head-on combat. Yet its size and complexity brought problems. It was slow, mechanically unreliable, and extremely expensive to build. Only a limited number could be produced, ensuring that Tigers would never replace Panzers as the backbone of armored divisions. Still, its psychological impact was immense, as both German crews and Soviet soldiers viewed it as a symbol of indestructible power. Alongside the Tiger came the Panther, introduced in 1943, which blended heavy armor and a high-velocity 75 mm gun with greater mobility. Designed specifically to counter the T-34, the Panther represented the pinnacle of German armored engineering. But both tanks required time, resources, and industrial focus, luxuries Germany was quickly losing as the war dragged on. The arms race was entering its most dangerous phase, where survival depended on innovation. The Panther, in particular, marked a turning point in the evolution of armored warfare. With its sloped armor inspired by the T-34 and its powerful Kursk 42 gun, it was capable of knocking out any Soviet tank at long ranges. Its balance of firepower, protection, and mobility made it one of the most feared tanks of the war. However, its rushed introduction led to severe reliability issues during the Battle of Kursk, where many broke down before even reaching combat. Despite these flaws, once refined, the Panther became Germany's most formidable medium tank, often outperforming the Panzer IV and standing alongside the Tiger as a premier weapon. Yet, like the Tiger, the Panther was resource-intensive and costly to maintain. German factories, bombed relentlessly by Allied air forces, struggled to meet production demands. By contrast, Soviet factories produced thousands of T-34s monthly, churning them out with brutal efficiency. This imbalance meant that even as German tanks grew technically superior, they were always outnumbered. Each loss was devastating, while the Soviets could absorb losses and replace them quickly. The Panzer Divisions faced not just an enemy tank, but an industrial giant in motion. The escalating arms race was not fought solely with machines but with doctrine. German commanders adapted their tactics, employing Tigers and Panthers as spearhead units while Panzer IV supported infantry and filled gaps. Soviet forces, however, evolved as well, forming larger tank corps that exploited numerical superiority. The Red Army began coordinating armor with artillery and air support in increasingly sophisticated operations. The battlefield became a contest of attrition, where German quality faced Soviet quantity, and neither side could afford mistakes. Panzer divisions relied heavily on experienced crews to offset numerical inferiority, often using ambush tactics and defensive positioning. Soviet tankers, meanwhile, pressed forward with relentless determination, willing to absorb casualties in pursuit of breakthroughs. The clash between T-34Cs, Panthers and Tigers defined the Eastern Front from 1942 onward. It was a contest of steel, fire and industrial endurance. And as the months passed, the German advantage in tactical innovation could not outweigh the Soviet tide. The Panzer Divisions, though formidable, were fighting against history itself. By 1943, the Eastern Front had become the world's largest armored battlefield. Stalingrad had already demonstrated that German tanks were not invincible, and Kursk would confirm it on a scale unimaginable in earlier wars. Thousands of T-34s clashed with Tigers and Panthers in battles that stretched for miles across the Russian steppe. The Panzer Divisions, once accustomed to decisive thrusts, were now locked in battles of attrition that drained their strength. German crews admired the skill and bravery of their Soviet adversaries, even as they fought to the last shell. Reports from the front described endless waves of T-34s, some destroyed, others advancing regardless of losses. The German tanks inflicted heavy casualties, but each victory was fleeting against the industrial might of the Soviet Union. The Panzer Division still commanded respect and fear, but the war had shifted irreversibly. The arms race, once thought to guarantee German dominance, was turning into a slow defeat. Each new tank produced in Germany was a masterpiece, but the Soviets answered with overwhelming numbers. The tide of history was beginning to turn. The rise of Soviet armor forever changed the trajectory of the war and the fate of the Panzer Divisions. The T-34 forced Germany to evolve, to design and deploy machines like the Panther and Tiger that represented the peak of engineering brilliance. Yet brilliance alone could not overcome the relentless flow of Soviet production. For every Tiger destroyed, the Soviets built dozens of T-34s. For every Panther lost, replacements were delayed by shortages of fuel, parts, or labor. The Panzer Divisions fought with courage and ingenuity, but they could not reverse the strategic imbalance. Soviet armor rolled westward, pushing the Wehrmacht back toward its own borders. The tank war had become not just a duel of steel, but a clash of ideologies and economies. German doctrine of rapid victories gave way to desperate defenses. The T-34 had reshaped the battlefield and rewritten the rules of armored warfare. From this point on, The Panzer Divisions would no longer dominate. They would fight for survival. By the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front was poised for a confrontation of unprecedented scale. After the disaster at Stalingrad, Hitler sought a decisive victory to restore German initiative, and his gaze fell upon a massive Soviet bulge around the city of Kursk. The salient stretched over 150 miles deep and wide, offering the Germans a tempting opportunity for encirclement. Operation Citadel, the code name for the offensive, was conceived as a pincer strike, Army Group South attacking from the south and Army Group Center from the north, their armored claws meant to meet behind Kursk. The plan aimed to destroy Soviet forces within the pocket, cut off their reserves, and reclaim the aura of Blitzkrieg. But unlike in 1941, the Soviets were prepared. Stalin and his generals knew the offensive was coming, thanks to detailed intelligence and partisan reports. Instead of retreating, they built an elaborate defense system, layering trenches, minefields, and artillery positions over hundreds of miles. Kursk became a fortress of steel and earth, a trap waiting to spring on the Panzer Divisions. The Germans were preparing to unleash their most advanced tanks, the Tiger and the Panther, but the Red Army had transformed into a war machine, ready to absorb and crush the blow. Operation Citadel began on July 5, 1943, with thunderous German artillery barrages, followed by the advance of armored spearheads. From the north, General Walter Model's 9th Army pushed toward Kursk, while from the south, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's elite Panzer Divisions surged forward. In the vanguard were the Tiger Rye and the brand new Panther, machines intended to shatter Soviet defenses with overwhelming firepower. Yet immediately, the Germans faced the reality of Soviet preparation. Minefields crippled tank advances, artillery rained down with devastating precision, and Soviet anti-tank guns picked off advancing panzers from concealed positions. Each mile forward was paid for in blood, steel, and exhaustion. German commanders realized they were not facing a retreating enemy, but a layered defense designed to bleed them dry. The promise of Blitzkrieg collapsed into grinding attrition. In the north, Model's assault slowed to a crawl, while in the south, Manstein's panzers made better progress, but still fell far short of their objectives. Kursk had become a war of endurance rather than speed, and the Panzer Divisions were straining under the weight of their own ambition. At the heart of the battle was Prokhorovka, where on July 12th, one of history's greatest tank clashes unfolded. The IASS Panzer Corps, including the feared Leibstandarte and Das Reich divisions, smashed into the Soviet 5th Guards tank army. Thousands of tanks churned across the fields, colliding in close-quarters combat that defied the precision tactics of earlier campaigns. Dust, smoke, and fire filled the air as Tigers and Panthers fired into waves of T-34s, while Soviet crews charged forward regardless of losses. The sheer density of tanks created chaos, with ramming, point-blank shots, and desperate maneuvers. Soviet commanders ordered counterattacks not to preserve their forces, but to halt the German advance at any cost. The battlefield became a furnace, consuming men and machines in staggering numbers. German gunners claimed enormous kills, but the Soviets kept coming, feeding fresh units into the fight. By nightfall, the Germans had failed to achieve the breakthrough Hitler demanded. Prokhorovka symbolized the futility of Citadel. Tactical brilliance on the German side could not overcome the Soviets' depth, numbers, and resilience. The myth of Panzer invincibility cracked under the strain. The technical debut of the Panther tank at Kursk revealed both its potential and its flaws. Designed as the answer to the T-34, it featured sloped armor and a powerful 75 mm gun capable of killing any Soviet vehicle at long range. On paper, it promised to restore German dominance, In practice, rushed production meant many Panthers broke down before even reaching battle. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, and mechanical reliability became as much a threat as Soviet shells. Crews often abandoned their machines after only a few days of combat, leaving fields littered with disabled vehicles. The Tiger, by contrast, performed well, shrugging off Soviet fire and dealing out destruction. Yet its small numbers meant it could not alter the course of the battle. German armoured strength, though formidable, was undermined by logistical fragility and industrial imbalance. Kursk demonstrated that even the most advanced technology could not win without overwhelming production and reliability. The Soviets had mastered not just resilience, but the ability to turn numbers into strategy, and the Germans could not outbuild or outlast them. For the Soviet Union, Kursk was the culmination of lessons learned since 1941. Generals like Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky orchestrated the defense with meticulous precision, deploying reserves in depth and timing counter-offensives to exploit German weakness. Over 1.3 million men, 3,600 tanks, and 20,000 artillery pieces were concentrated in the salient, a defensive colossus unmatched in military history. Behind them stood vast reserves of industry, pouring out T-34 sis faster than the Germans could destroy them. Soviet air forces swarmed the skies, contesting Luftwaffe dominance for the first time. Each German thrust met layers of defense, and when exhausted, the Soviets counterattacked with overwhelming force. Unlike earlier years, the Red Army was no longer merely surviving, it was dictating the terms of battle. Kursk marked the point where Soviet strategy matured into offensive mastery. The Germans, once the hunters, had become the hunted, and Kursk would forever stand as proof of this reversal. The Soviet victory was not only military but symbolic, a demonstration that the Red Army could defeat Germany in a battle of its own choosing. The failure of Operation Citadel had profound consequences for the Panzer Divisions. Hitler had staked everything on the offensive, delaying it for months to await new weapons, only to see them squandered in futile assaults. The loss of tanks at Kursk, hundreds destroyed, thousands damaged, eroded Germany's armoured reserves beyond repair. Crews who had trained for years were lost in days, irreplaceable in both experience and morale. The Wehrmacht's aura of offensive superiority evaporated, replaced by a grim defensive posture that would last until the end of the war. Panzer divisions that once spearheaded lightning campaigns were now forced into desperate counterattacks and retreats. Kursk proved that the age of Blitzkrieg was over. From this point forward, the Germans would never again mount a large-scale strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. The Panzer Divisions, once instruments of conquest, had become tools of delay. Their glory days ended in the fields of Kursk, buried beneath the wreckage of burned-out armor and the determination of Soviet steel. The psychological blow of Kursk was as devastating as the material losses. German officers privately admitted that the war in the East could no longer be won. Hitler, frustrated and paranoid, increasingly interfered with strategy, dismissing commanders who dared speak truth. For the panzer crews, morale faltered under the realization that no matter how skillfully they fought, they could not halt the Soviet tide. Soldiers who had once believed in swift victory now spoke of survival. Letters home carried despair rather than triumph, acknowledging the futility of continued offensives. In contrast, Soviet propaganda celebrated Kursk as proof of inevitable victory, boosting morale across the Red Army and among civilians who had endured years of suffering. Kursk became a turning point in perception as well as reality. Germany was now seen as vulnerable, and the Soviet Union as unstoppable. The myth of German invincibility, crafted since 1939, was shattered irreparably. The battlefield of Kursk was not just a military defeat, but a psychological collapse of faith in Blitzkrieg. The Panzers had met their match, and the world knew it. In retrospect, Kursk stands as the largest tank battle in history, a clash of more than 6,000 armored vehicles across rolling fields that became graveyards of steel. It was not a single battle, but a campaign of attrition that consumed men, machines, and resources at a scale unimaginable before. Operation Citadel ended in failure, and with it ended Germany's chance to seize the initiative in the east. From this point forward, the Red Army pushed relentlessly westward, never again losing momentum. The Panzer Divisions, once symbols of unstoppable force, were now shadows of their former selves, bleeding strength in battles they could not afford. Kursk demonstrated the limits of technology without mass production, the futility of aggression without strategic foresight. It marked the true breaking point of the Wehrmacht's armored spearheads. The backbone of the Panzer Divisions, forged in Poland and France, was snapped in the fields around Kursk. The war of movement had given way to a war of attrition, one Germany could not win. Kursk was not just a defeat, it was the beginning of the end. After the wreckage of Kursk, the Panzer Divisions found themselves in a role for which they had never been originally designed: defense. The lightning thrusts of Blitzkrieg, once symbols of German mastery, were replaced by grim rearguard battles fought across the vast plains of Ukraine and Russia. Hitler demanded that his armies hold ground at all costs, but reality forced the generals to improvise. Panzer commanders began to employ what became known as elastic defense, conceding territory when pressed, then counterattacking with concentrated armor to blunt Soviet advances. This was not the sweeping maneuver warfare of 1940, but a desperate adaptation to Soviet numerical superiority. The Wehrmacht no longer dictated the pace. It responded, striking like a cornered animal, fierce but wounded. Soviet armor poured forward in masses, spearheaded by T-34 SES and increasingly supported by heavy tanks like the KV and the new IS-2. Against this tide, the Panzers could only buy time, inflicting casualties but unable to reverse the momentum. For the first time in the war, German tank crews understood that every mile gained by the Soviets was permanent. Retreat had become the new reality, and defense their only strategy. The Panzer Divisions retreating across Ukraine faced overwhelming challenges. Fuel shortages plagued every movement, with tank commanders forced to abandon vehicles for lack of supplies, rather than combat damage. Spare parts were scarce, meaning many panzers were cannibalized to keep a few running. Soviet artillery barrages preceded nearly every attack, grinding German positions before armor surged forward. The panzers, once predators, now crouched in defensive ambushes, hiding in forests and villages to strike unsuspecting Soviet columns. This tactic inflicted heavy losses, but the Soviets' ability to replace men and machines dwarfed anything Germany could manage. German armor was increasingly pulled into fire brigade roles, rushing from sector to sector to plug gaps in collapsing lines. Tank crews, exhausted and under constant pressure, often fought for days without rest, their machines breaking down from relentless use. Yet in these battles flashes of brilliance still emerged, as German counterattacks occasionally cut off and destroyed advancing Soviet spearheads. These victories, however, were temporary sparks in a darkening landscape. The Soviets always returned with more, and the Germans were forced to retreat again and again. The battles in Ukraine during 1943 and 1944 highlighted the new character of panzer warfare. Gone was the open freedom of sweeping maneuvers across enemy rear lines. In its place came bitter fighting over river crossings, fortified towns, and vital crossroads. The Dnieper River became a symbol of this shift, as German Panzer Divisions struggled to hold bridges and deny crossings to Soviet forces. Defensive lines were constructed with anti-tank ditches, minefields, and artillery support, but Soviet engineers and armored spearheads smashed through with relentless determination. Elastic defense meant falling back to secondary positions, striking when the enemy overextended, then retreating again. German commanders like Hermann Balck and Hasso von Manteuffel earned reputations for conducting masterful delaying actions, using small panzer groups to inflict disproportionate losses. Yet these tactical achievements did not alter the strategic imbalance. Every defensive success was measured in days bought, not territory held. The Soviet tide rolled forward inexorably, forcing German tankers into a war of survival rather than conquest. The Panzer Divisions, once instruments of lightning, had become shields of desperation. One of the starkest differences in this new phase was the sheer scale of Soviet armored superiority. By 1944, Soviet factories produced thousands of T-34s each month, ensuring that losses in battle were quickly replaced. In contrast, German industry, bombed and overstretched, could not keep pace with demand. The Tiger and Panther, while formidable, were too few to stem the tide. For every Tiger on the battlefield, there were dozens of T-34C ready to encircle and overwhelm it. German crews relied on superior gunnery and tactics, often knocking out multiple Soviet tanks before being destroyed themselves. Still, the mathematics of attrition doomed them. Even when panzers inflicted 3 or 4 times their losses, the Red Army advanced. Soviet commanders no longer hesitated to throw entire tank corps into frontal assaults, knowing replacements stood behind them. The battlefield became a grinder of steel, and in that grinder, German divisions steadily crumbled. The Panzer Arm, once the jewel of the Wehrmacht, was being consumed faster than it could be rebuilt. Retreat also brought new hardships beyond the battlefield. Panzer units withdrawing through Ukraine encountered devastated infrastructure, burned villages, and hostile partisans. Supply columns were harassed, bridges blown up, and communications severed by local resistance movements. Soviet partisans became an unseen enemy, striking fuel convoys or ambushing isolated tanks. In this hostile environment, the panzers' mobility, once their greatest asset, was constantly compromised. Crews lived in constant uncertainty, knowing the enemy was not just ahead, but all around them. Civilians, once cowed by German occupation, now openly aided the Soviets, providing intelligence and shelter. This forced Panzer Divisions to divert men and resources toward rear security, weakening their ability to fight at the front. The psychological strain of this environment was immense, as German soldiers fought not only the Red Army, but the entire population rising against them. The war of conquest had become a war of retreat, fought across hostile lands that offered no sanctuary. The defensive battles also revealed the growing skill of Soviet tank commanders. By 1943, Soviet generals had learned from earlier disasters and were now adept at coordinating armor, infantry, and artillery. Massive offensives, such as those during the Dnieper and later in Operation Bagration, demonstrated the Red Army's ability to launch multi-front assaults. German defenses, even when skillfully arranged, were systematically dismantled by overwhelming firepower and coordinated attacks. Panzer counterattacks, once decisive, now resembled desperate thrusts against an impenetrable wall. The Soviets, using deep battle theory, attacked in successive waves, ensuring no pause for German recovery. Once the first wave was blunted, fresh reserves poured in to continue the assault. German tankers, who once prided themselves on tactical superiority, now faced opponents who matched them in skill and outmatched them in numbers. The battlefield equation had shifted permanently, and the Panzers could not adapt fast enough. Soviet dominance was now not only material but intellectual, turning the tide irreversibly. As the retreat continued into 1944, the role of the Panzer Divisions became increasingly symbolic. No longer capable of strategic victories, they represented the last vestige of German fighting spirit. Propaganda portrayed them as heroic defenders buying time for the Reich. In truth, they were shadows of their former selves, their ranks depleted, their machines worn. Entire divisions were reduced to a handful of serviceable tanks, supported by infantry in makeshift formations. Yet the myth of panzer prowess persisted, even as reality crumbled. Crews who had once believed in swift victories now fought only for survival, clinging to the hope of returning home. The defensive role demanded courage, but offered no glory. Every battle was a retreat, every stand temporary, every victory hollow. For the Panzer Divisions, retreat was not a tactic, but a way of life, and defense their only option in a war slipping from their grasp. By the end of 1944, the Panzer arm had undergone a profound transformation. From the sharp spearhead of Blitzkrieg, it had become a battered shield, wielded to delay the inevitable rather than secure triumph. Elastic defense, counterattacks, and tactical brilliance could not conceal the collapse of strategic strength. Soviet armored forces, growing in power, drove deeper into Eastern Europe, while German divisions dwindled. The battlefield balance had shifted so decisively that survival became the true measure of success for panzer units. Kursk had marked the end of offensive ambition, and Ukraine symbolized the futility of German resistance. Each retreat carried the panzers closer to their homeland, a journey not of conquest but of collapse. The divisions that once embodied Nazi dominance were now fighting for the Reich's survival. Their retreat was not merely physical but symbolic, a testament to the crumbling dream of German supremacy. In the story of the Panzers, the chapter of retreat and defense was one of resilience, but also of irreversible decline. When Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the German Panzer Divisions were seen as the critical force that could throw the invaders back into the sea. Hitler himself had placed immense faith in his armored units, believing they were the decisive element in halting any invasion. Yet their deployment was hampered by indecision, conflicting chains of command, and the Luftwaffe's loss of air superiority. While Field Marshal Rommel argued for immediate deployment close to the coast to strike swiftly, others, including von Rundstedt, preferred to keep the panzers further inland as a central reserve. This disagreement meant that on D-Day itself, the armoured divisions did not strike with full force. The Allies gained precious time to consolidate their beachheads, bringing in men, tanks, and supplies. When the panzers finally moved, they advanced under skies dominated by Allied aircraft, which pounced on every column that dared to move by day. German tankers who once roared across open terrain were now forced to creep through hedgerows, camouflaging their machines under trees. The promise of armoured counterattack that had terrified Allied planners proved sluggish and delayed. Instead of shattering the invasion, the panzers found themselves locked in a battle for survival. Normandy would prove not a battlefield of blitzkrieg, but a graveyard of German armoured strength. The terrain of Normandy itself was hostile to armoured warfare. Unlike the wide-open steppes of Russia or the deserts of North Africa, the Bocage countryside was a claustrophobic maze of hedgerows, narrow lanes and sunken roads. Each field was surrounded by earthen walls and thick vegetation, turning the landscape into a natural fortress. For the Panzer Divisions, this meant that maneuver warfare was nearly impossible. Tanks had to move slowly, one at a time, often exposing themselves to ambush. Allied infantry, supported by portable anti-tank weapons, could lie in wait behind hedgerows, and strike as panzers tried to break through. The Germans, who once thrived on speed and mobility, were reduced to grinding assaults measured in meters, not kilometers. Even powerful machines like the Panther and Tiger tanks struggled to make an impact in this terrain. Mechanical breakdowns were common as tanks pushed through rough ground and hedges. For the German armored divisions, Normandy was not the proving ground of maneuver, but the slow suffocation of their tactical advantages. The very land seemed to conspire against them, trapping them in battles they could not win. The battle for Caen became the focal point of armored warfare in Normandy. This historic city, captured by the Allies weeks later than planned, saw some of the fiercest panzer engagements of the campaign. German units, including the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and the Panzer Lehr Division, defended the approaches with fanatical determination. Caen was vital because it commanded key roads and open terrain suitable for armored maneuver once seized. The Allies recognized this, and they poured divisions, artillery, and airstrikes into the battle. For the German panzers, it was a grinding defense, with counterattacks launched under constant threat of Allied airstrikes. Tanks had to move by night and hide by day, a reversal of Blitzkrieg's principles. The Germans inflicted heavy casualties, but their own losses mounted steadily, especially as the Allies brought overwhelming firepower. Entire panzer battalions were reduced to skeleton forces, their ranks filled with burned-out hulks. The battle for Caen dragged on for weeks, symbolizing the stubborn defense, but also the futility of German resistance. The panzers were holding ground, but at an unsustainable cost. Allied air supremacy became the single greatest obstacle to German armored operations. By 1944, the Luftwaffe had been bled dry on both the Eastern Front and in the defense of Germany. In Normandy, German tank crews looked to the skies with dread, for Allied fighter bombers roamed freely. The feared Hawker Typhoon and P-47 Thunderbolt strafed and bombed every road, every suspected tank concentration, and even individual vehicles caught moving in daylight. Convoys were shredded before they could reach the front lines. Entire panzer counterattacks stalled because Allied aircraft destroyed bridges, fuel trucks, and reinforcements. German commanders tried dispersing tanks into small groups, camouflaging them in orchards and villages, but Allied reconnaissance eventually found them. The skies had become a killing ground, where armored mobility was strangled before it began. For the first time in the war, the Panzer Divisions were not beaten primarily by enemy tanks, but by planes. The Luftwaffe could offer little more than token resistance, leaving the ground forces to fight under constant bombardment. Air supremacy ensured that the Allies dictated the tempo, while the panzers were forced into a reactive role. Blitzkrieg was no longer possible in skies ruled by the enemy. Despite overwhelming odds, the German armored divisions displayed remarkable tactical skill. The Panzer Lehr Division, considered one of the best equipped armored formations, fought valiantly against American forces near Saint-Lô. Its veteran tank crews inflicted heavy casualties, often using ambush tactics and precise gunnery to halt Allied advances. Similarly, the 2nd and 21st Panzer Divisions engaged British and Canadian forces in brutal back-and-forth battles around Cannes. Yet these tactical successes could not mask the strategic collapse. Every destroyed Allied tank was swiftly replaced, while German losses were irreplaceable. Allied logistics poured an endless stream of Shermans, Cromwells, and Fireflies into the fight, supported by artillery and air strikes. German industry, strangled by bombing and shortages, could not keep up. By July, the German armored divisions in Normandy were bleeding to death. Even as they scored local victories, the wider battlefield slipped away from them. The skill of the panzer crews was undeniable, but they fought in a war that had already passed them by. Normandy was no longer about brilliance, it was about survival. The climax of German armoured defeat in Normandy came with the Falaise Pocket. In August 1944, as the Allies broke through German lines during Operation Cobra, the Panzer Divisions found themselves trapped. Encircled near the town of Falaise, remnants of multiple divisions, including armoured units, struggled to escape. The pocket became a killing ground, bombarded from the air and shelled relentlessly. German tanks tried to break out, but most were destroyed or abandoned. Fields were littered with smouldering wrecks, the skeletons of what had once been proud panzer formations. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured, while equipment losses were catastrophic. The panzers, already weakened, were annihilated in the slaughter. For survivors, it was a retreat through fire, leaving behind comrades and machines alike. The Falaise disaster sealed the fate of German armour in France. From that moment on, retreat toward the Reich was the only path left. The destruction of the Panzer Divisions in Normandy marked more than just a battlefield defeat. It was the collapse of Germany's ability to resist in the West. The armoured reserves that Hitler had hoarded for years were squandered in desperate counterattacks, often ordered too late or too rashly. The once feared Panzer Corps were now reduced to fragments, many divisions existing only on paper. Survivors retreated toward the Seine, hounded by Allied pursuit and aerial bombardment. For German tank crews, the campaign had been a nightmare, fighting without fuel, without air support, and often without hope. The propaganda image of invincible panzers was shattered in the hedgerows and fields of Normandy. What remained was a battered remnant of once mighty divisions. The Allies, by contrast, emerged with growing confidence, proving that their combined arms doctrine could defeat even Germany's best. Normandy was not just a turning point, it was the beginning of the end for German armour in the West. The Panzer Divisions would never again recover their strength. Looking back, the Normandy campaign revealed the fragility of the Panzer legend when stripped of favourable conditions. The tanks themselves remained formidable, but without air cover, fuel, and manoeuvre space, they were reduced to targets. The Allied mastery of logistics, technology, and strategy turned the battlefield against them. For the German crews who fought there, Normandy was a cruel education in the realities of modern warfare. The age of Blitzkrieg had ended. The age of total Allied superiority had begun. The hedgerows, the skies filled with enemy planes, and the burning wrecks of tanks told the story of decline. From the beaches to Falaise, the Panzer Divisions had fought with courage, but at a terrible cost. Their sacrifice delayed the Allies, but could not deny them victory. Normandy was the graveyard of German armoured power in the West. It marked the point where the panzers could no longer shape the war, but only prolong its inevitable conclusion. The German Panzer Divisions reached their peak of technical sophistication with the introduction of the Panther and Tiger tanks. These machines were conceived not merely as battlefield weapons, but as statements of German engineering superiority. The Panther, designed after encountering the Soviet T-34, was intended to blend mobility, firepower, and armor into a balanced package. Its long-barreled 75 mm gun could destroy almost any Allied tank at long ranges, often before enemy fire could even reach it. The Tiger, by contrast, was conceived as a behemoth, its 88 mm cannon capable of annihilating even the heaviest Allied armor with a single shot. The sheer presence of the Tiger created terror among Allied crews, who often exaggerated its numbers on the battlefield. Yet behind the aura of invincibility lay harsh realities. These tanks were expensive to build, difficult to maintain, and prone to mechanical breakdowns. German industry, strained under the burden of producing such advanced machines in large numbers. While their battlefield impact was undeniable, their long-term sustainability was far less certain. The legends of the Panther and Tiger would endure, but so too would the stories of their flaws. The Panther, officially designated Panzer Kampfwagen V, made its combat debut at Kursk in July 1943. Intended as the answer to the T-34, its sloped armor provided excellent protection against most Allied guns. Its high-velocity 75 mm Kalais 42 cannon could punch through enemy armor at over 2 kilometers, a staggering advantage in open battle. However, its rushed development meant that the early models were plagued with problems. At Kursk, many Panthers broke down before even reaching the battlefield, their transmissions and engines overheating under strain. Crews were forced to abandon dozens of tanks due to mechanical failures rather than enemy fire. As the war progressed, these issues were gradually reduced, but the Panther never lost its reputation for fragility. Still, when operating at full efficiency, it was arguably the best medium tank of the war. Allied tank crews dreaded facing it in open combat, where its accuracy and firepower proved devastating. The Panther embodied both German ambition and German overreach, brilliant in design, but hampered by industrial and logistical limitations. The Tiger I, introduced in late 1942, represented a completely different philosophy. Unlike the relatively balanced Panther, the Tiger was a weapon of intimidation as much as destruction. Its 88 mm Coley K-36 gun, derived from the famous anti-aircraft cannon, was capable of destroying any Allied tank from extreme distances. Its frontal armor was nearly impenetrable to most weapons available at the time, forcing Allied tankers to attack from the sides or rear. On the battlefield, a single Tiger could dominate entire sectors, its crews often racking up dozens of kills. Stories of Tigers holding off overwhelming Allied forces became the stuff of legend, yet its design came with heavy costs. Weighing nearly 60 tons, it consumed enormous amounts of fuel, which Germany increasingly lacked. Its complex engineering meant constant repairs, with tanks often immobilized for want of spare parts. For every Tiger that reached the front lines, many others languished in workshops. Despite this, the Tiger's myth only grew, cementing its place as one of the most feared tanks of World War II. Even more fearsome was the Tiger II, or King Tiger, introduced in 1944. This tank combined the massive 88 mm Colt K-43 cannon with armor thicker than almost anything fielded during the war. At over 70 tons, it was virtually impervious from the front to Allied tank and anti-tank fire. Yet this increase in size and power further strained German logistics. Bridges collapsed under its weight, engines overheated, and mechanical breakdowns were frequent. Only about 500 Tiger IIs were built, too few to influence the war's outcome. On the battlefield, they were formidable, often destroying dozens of enemy tanks before being lost. However, their sheer cost and complexity made them a poor return on investment compared to simpler designs. Crews admired their power but cursed their unreliability. The King Tiger symbolized the paradox of German engineering, a technological marvel produced at the expense of practicality. By the end of the war, many King Tigers were destroyed not by enemy fire, but by abandonment when fuel and parts ran out. The legends of the Panther and Tiger were amplified by Nazi propaganda. German newsreels proudly showcased their size, firepower, and supposed invincibility. Soldiers on the eastern and western fronts spoke in awe of these machines, spreading stories that exaggerated their numbers. For Allied soldiers, the psychological effect was profound. Even when only a handful of Tigers were present, Rumors spread of entire divisions of them, causing fear and hesitation. Allied tank crews often misidentified other German tanks as Tigers, reinforcing the myth. Yet for every successful engagement, there were also failures, breakdowns, logistical disasters, or overwhelming Allied air power that rendered these tanks vulnerable. The myth persisted because of the contrast between their technical brilliance and their battlefield struggles. To the outside world, they symbolized German military might. To the soldiers who fought in them, they were both a source of pride and a constant reminder of mechanical fragility. The Tiger and Panther became larger than life, their reputation extending far beyond their actual numbers. Logistics proved to be the greatest enemy of the Panther and Tiger divisions. Supplying fuel, spare parts, and recovery vehicles for such massive machines was a nightmare for the overstretched German army. In retreat, tanks were often abandoned simply because they ran out of fuel. Recovery of damaged tanks was nearly impossible without specialized equipment, which was always in short supply. Many Panthers and Tigers were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. Production itself was another issue. Germany simply could not produce them in the quantities needed to match Allied numerical superiority, where the Allies could field thousands of Shermans or T-34 Sits. Germany deployed only hundreds of Panthers or Tigers. While each German tank was technically superior, the Allied ability to replace losses quickly nullified that advantage. War, ultimately, was not just about quality, but also about quantity. The logistical imbalance sealed the fate of even Germany's most advanced tanks. They were masterpieces of engineering, but ill-suited to the demands of total war. On the battlefield, the performance of the Panther and Tiger often depended on the conditions. In defensive battles, where they could set ambushes and fire from long range, they proved devastating. Allied tank losses in encounters with these machines were often severe, with Shermans and Cromwells outmatched. In open fields, a Tiger or Panther could dominate, sometimes knocking out entire formations. Yet in fluid operations or prolonged campaigns, their weaknesses emerged. Mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and air attacks limited their effectiveness. While feared individually, they could not alter the overall tide of the war. Allied tactics evolved to counter them, relying on artillery, aircraft, and numerical superiority. Soviet tankers learned to swarm them, while American crews relied on coordination and overwhelming fire support. Even the best German tanks could not win a war alone. They became symbols of brilliance, fighting against inevitability. Their reputation grew even as their actual impact dwindled. In the post-war years, the Panther and Tiger became legendary symbols of World War II armored warfare. Military historians and enthusiasts debated their strengths and weaknesses, often exaggerating their prowess. Museums proudly displayed surviving examples, while veterans recounted stories of their encounters. The myth of invincibility lingered, reinforced by films, books, and popular culture. Yet careful study reveals the truth. These tanks were formidable but flawed. Their battlefield impact was real, but far smaller than their legend suggests. They were marvels of design but disasters of production and maintenance. The Allies won not by matching them tank for tank, but by outproducing, outsupplying, and outmaneuvering them. The Panther and Tiger stand as monuments to both the brilliance and folly of German military engineering. They are remembered as icons, but also as cautionary tales of weapons that dazzled without delivering victory. Their legend endures, but so does the reality that they could not save the Reich. In December 1944, the German High Command launched what would become its final great armored offensive in the West. Known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, or the Ardennes Offensive, it was a desperate gamble to reverse Germany's declining fortunes. Hitler envisioned a massive strike through the dense Ardennes forest, aiming to split the Allied front, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The operation would rely heavily on Panzer Divisions, many of them battered but reconstituted after the defeats in France and the East. The element of surprise was critical, for the Allies believed the Ardennes to be quiet, a sector unsuited for armoured thrusts. In the opening hours, German tanks rumbled forward under the cover of heavy fog, masking their movements from Allied aircraft. Thousands of men and machines surged through the narrow, icy roads of Belgium and Luxembourg. Elite units, including the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, spearheaded the attack with King Tigers and Panthers. The initial shock was devastating, with American lines buckling under the assault. Towns were overrun, and units scattered in confusion. For a brief moment, it seemed that Germany had rekindled the power of Blitzkrieg. The early success of the offensive stunned Allied commanders. American troops, many of them green or under-equipped, were caught off guard in small outposts along the Ardennes. German tanks surged forward, overrunning defensive positions and capturing prisoners in droves. With and along the Elsenborn Ridge, US forces found themselves encircled or in danger of collapse. Communications broke down, with some units fighting blindly in snow-covered forests, unaware of the scale of the assault. German panzers exploited the confusion, their spearheads pushing westward with determination. Columns of Panthers and King Tigers thundered down icy roads, while half-tracks carried infantry to secure captured ground. Morale soared among German troops, who believed they had seized the initiative once more. Hitler and his generals celebrated what appeared to be the rebirth of armoured might. Yet beneath the surface, cracks already threatened the offensive. Fuel shortages plagued the advancing columns, while Allied resistance stiffened more quickly than the Germans had anticipated. The gamble had begun, but the cost of sustaining it loomed large. Central to the German plan was speed, but speed was precisely what the offensive lacked. The Ardennes terrain, with its dense forests, narrow roads and snow-draped hills, proved treacherous for massed armour. Panthers and Tigers, already cumbersome machines, found themselves delayed by bottlenecks where entire columns backed up for miles. Bridges became choke points, vulnerable to American engineers and artillery fire. Fuel shortages compounded the problem, with tanks abandoned on roadsides after exhausting their precious reserves. German logistics were incapable of sustaining the scale of the operation, and their armoured might became trapped in a slow crawl. Every hour lost gave the Allies more time to regroup and respond. The fog that had initially aided the Germans began to clear, allowing Allied air forces to strike with lethal effect. Bombers and fighter bombers hunted German columns, destroying fuel dumps and knocking out tanks from the skies. The supposed lightning strike became mired in attrition. The dream of reaching Antwerp slipped further into impossibility. Nowhere did the battle's drama play out more vividly than at Bastogne. This small Belgian town became the focal point of the German thrust, a critical road hub that the Panzers needed to secure. Surrounded by German forces, the 101st Airborne Division and elements of US armoured units dug in for a desperate defence. Despite overwhelming odds, the Americans held firm, repelling repeated assaults by German armour. The sight of King Tigers lumbering toward their lines was terrifying, but anti-tank guns, bazookas and sheer determination kept them at bay. German commanders, frustrated by the stubborn resistance, diverted precious time and resources to break the pocket. Yet every failed assault drained their strength further, while the defenders' courage became a rallying point for Allied morale. The famous reply of General Anthony McAuliffe to a German surrender demand, nuts echoed as a symbol of defiance. Baston's survival denied the Germans their key crossroads. It was the beginning of the end for Hitler's last gamble. The Panzers had met not only terrain and logistics, but also unyielding human will. As the offensive dragged on, the reality of German weakness became undeniable. Fuel shortages crippled the advance, with entire panzer units immobilized and abandoned. Allied air superiority, once grounded by weather, returned with devastating power. Fighter bombers prowled the skies, turning German convoys into burning wrecks along the frozen roads. Supply lines stretched thin, unable to sustain the offensive as ammunition and food dwindled. American reinforcements poured into the Ardennes, bolstering defenses and counterattacking with fresh strength. Patton's Third Army pivoted north in a daring maneuver, striking into the German flank and relieving Bastogne. German armored divisions, once the spearhead of the attack, now found themselves encircled, cut off, and bled dry. Desperation replaced momentum, as tank crews fought, knowing that fuel shortages and Allied artillery doomed their efforts. The final thrust toward Antwerp was abandoned. What remained was a grim struggle to retreat and preserve what was left of the panzer force. The dream of splitting the Allies had turned to ruin. The failure of the Ardennes offensive was catastrophic for Germany's armored divisions. Already depleted from years of attrition, they suffered losses they could never replace. Thousands of tanks, half-tracks, and vehicles were destroyed or abandoned in the snow. Entire divisions ceased to exist as effective fighting units, their survivors retreating on foot. Hitler had gambled his last reserves of armor on a strike that lacked the resources to succeed. His generals, many of whom had warned against the offensive, watched helplessly as the cream of the panzer force was wasted. The Allies, though stunned by the initial assault, quickly regained control and inflicted devastating casualties. The Luftwaffe, too, suffered irreplaceable losses in the desperate battles over the Ardennes skies. German morale, already fragile, sank further as soldiers realized the war was now unwinnable. The Ardennes offensive was not a rebirth of Blitzkrieg, but its funeral march. From this point forward, German armor would never again mount an operation on such a scale. For the Allies, the Battle of the Bulge became both a test of endurance and a symbol of resilience. American troops, many inexperienced, had faced the full fury of Germany's remaining armored might. Their ability to hold, regroup, and counterattack under dire conditions spoke volumes about Allied training, logistics, and leadership. The freezing forests of the Ardennes became a crucible of courage where tanks, infantry, and artillery worked together in harmony. The defeat of the German offensive demonstrated not only tactical superiority, but also the sheer weight of Allied resources. Factories in America and Britain continued to churn out tanks, planes, and supplies in numbers the Germans could never match. While the German soldier fought with determination, his weapons could not overcome shortages of fuel, food, and air cover. The battle proved that even the most ambitious German gambles were doomed against overwhelming Allied might. By January 1945, the lines were restored, and the Allies stood poised to advance into the heart of Germany. The Ardennes marked the final act of German offensive capability in the West. Its failure sealed the fate of the Reich. The legacy of the Ardennes offensive lives on as one of World War II's most dramatic battles. For Germany, it was the last gasp of panzer dominance, a futile strike born of desperation. For the Allies, it was both a shock and a triumph, a reminder that even in the war's final months, the enemy remained dangerous. The battle revealed the brilliance and bravery of German tank crews, but also the fatal flaws of their command and logistics. It exposed Hitler's obsession with offensive operations, blind to reality, and dismissive of his generals' warnings. It showcased the resilience of American troops, who held their ground against overwhelming pressure, and it highlighted the decisive role of air power and industrial might in modern warfare. The Ardennes was not merely a battlefield but a symbol of transition, the point where German armored power was finally broken. The Panzer Divisions would continue to fight, but never again with the strength to shape the course of the war. The last gamble had been played, and it had failed. By late 1944, the Eastern Front had become a graveyard for the Panzer Divisions that once stormed across Europe. The Red Army, rejuvenated by victories in Operation Bagration, surged westward with unstoppable momentum. German forces, including their armored spearheads, were no longer the hunters, they were the hunted, scrambling to delay the Soviet tide. Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs left panzer units trapped in impossible positions, forced to defend every village, river, and crossroads. In Poland, Hungary, and East Prussia, armored clashes erupted daily, but the Germans lacked the reserves to mount effective counteroffensives. Supply shortages meant that many panzer divisions fought at a fraction of their intended strength, sometimes with only a handful of tanks. Nevertheless, the crews fought with desperation, eking out victories in localized battles, ambushes, and defensive stands. Villages were transformed into fortresses, with panzers dug in as immobile bunkers firing until destroyed. Soviet tank armies, spearheaded by T-34 Sears, ES-2 heavy tanks, and mechanized infantry, pressed forward relentlessly. The Germans fought on familiar soil, but their homeland was being consumed. For the first time, the Reich itself became the battleground. One of the fiercest struggles came in Hungary, a land Hitler considered vital to the German war effort. Hungary was not only a political ally, but also a source of oil, and its fields around Nagy Kanisa and Szeged fueled the German war machine. As the Soviets advanced into the Carpathian Basin in late 1944, Hitler committed his armored reserves to hold the line. Panzer divisions, including the 3rd and 6th SS Panzer, were redeployed to the region, tasked with halting the Soviet advance. Budapest, the Hungarian capital, became a fortress city, encircled and besieged in December 1944. The Panzer divisions fought desperately to relieve the city, launching counterattacks that clawed back ground but ultimately failed. Soviet artillery and tanks pounded the defenders relentlessly, turning streets into infernos of rubble and blood. Inside Budapest, German and Hungarian troops endured starvation and constant bombardment, clinging to ruined buildings. The failure to rescue the city sealed its doom, and Budapest fell in February 1945 after a brutal siege. The Panzer divisions bled heavily in the effort, their strength shattered for little gain. Hungary's fall meant the Reich was running out of oil and time. Even as Budapest fell, Hitler's obsession with armored counterblows produced one final offensive in the region, Operation Frühlingserwachen or Spring Awakening, in March 1945. Concentrated around Lake Balaton, Germany's last significant oil region, the offensive brought together the remnants of the Waffen SS Panzer divisions. Tiger II tanks and Panthers spearheaded the assault, attempting to break Soviet lines and secure the oil fields. For a brief moment, German armor once again pushed forward, creating pockets of panic among Soviet defenders. But the Red Army had grown too powerful, too experienced, and too well supplied. The offensive bogged down almost immediately, hindered by mud, overstretched logistics, and Soviet depth in defense. Stalin's counterstroke was overwhelming, with waves of tanks, artillery, and infantry smashing into the exhausted panzers. Within weeks, the Germans were not only stopped but driven back in humiliating retreat. Many of the prized Tiger II tanks were abandoned in the mud, unable to move for lack of fuel. Operation Spring Awakening became a final epitaph for German armored power. The last reserves had been wasted in a battle that achieved nothing but further exhaustion. As the front collapsed, East Prussia became a cauldron of despair for German soldiers and civilians alike. Once the proud heartland of Prussian militarism, it was now besieged on all sides by Soviet armies. Panzer Divisions attempted to hold back the Red Army in desperate rearguard actions, but their numbers were too few. The encirclement of Königsberg and the battles along the Baltic coast epitomized the hopelessness of the struggle. German tank crews, knowing there was no escape, fought with grim determination to buy time for civilians to flee westward. Roads clogged with refugees came under Soviet artillery fire, creating scenes of chaos and horror. Panzers, once the symbols of lightning war, now burned in snow-covered fields, unable to alter the outcome. The Wehrmacht's armored reserves in East Prussia were gradually annihilated, destroyed piecemeal as fuel and ammunition dwindled. Soviet tanks rolled across frozen rivers, smashing through defenses with brute force. East Prussia was lost, and with it vanished any illusion that Germany could still hold the East. The homeland was now open to invasion, and Berlin loomed as the final prize. By the spring of 1945, the Soviet juggernaut was advancing on all fronts, and German armored formations were shells of their former selves. Divisions that once fielded hundreds of tanks now counted a few dozen, sometimes fewer. Crews fought in patched-up machines, scavenging parts from wrecks to keep vehicles running. The Soviets, in contrast, flooded the battlefield with thousands of tanks and self-propelled guns, their production unmatched by a collapsing German industry. On the Vistula and Oder fronts, massive Soviet offensives unleashed artillery barrages that shook the earth. German panzers counterattacked valiantly, striking Soviet spearheads and destroying tanks in sharp local engagements. Yet every success was fleeting, for Soviet reserves simply replaced the losses and pressed forward again. The Panzer Divisions fought delaying actions, retreating from one river line to the next. Each retreat brought the Soviets closer to Berlin, each stand more costly than the last. Exhaustion, despair, and inevitability hung heavy over the men inside the steel hulls. The Panzers were fighting their last battles, not for victory but for survival. The Battle of Seelow Heights in April 1945 was the last great defensive stand before Berlin itself. Along the Oder River, German forces, including panzer remnants, entrenched themselves on commanding ground. Hitler demanded a fight to the death, ordering that not a step be given. Soviet Marshal Zhukov hurled his armies forward in an offensive of unprecedented scale. Thousands of tanks, guns, and aircraft pounded the German lines in a storm of fire. German panzers counterattacked from hidden positions, ambushing Soviet armor in fierce engagements. The defenders fought with extraordinary courage, knocking out scores of tanks, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Soviet waves simply rolled over the battered defenders, overwhelming them with sheer force. The Panzer Divisions were shattered in the struggle, their surviving tanks burning amid smoking ruins. The failure to hold Seelow Heights opened the gates to Berlin itself. The capital of the Reich was now surrounded, with Soviet tanks closing in from every direction. The last act of the war had begun. Inside Berlin, the final days of armored warfare were surreal and tragic. Panzer Divisions, once symbols of Blitzkrieg, were reduced to a handful of tanks scattered across rubble-strewn streets. Tiger-Tiers and Panthers, immobile for lack of fuel, were used as stationary gun platforms at intersections. Crews, many of them teenagers from hastily trained units, fought with desperation against overwhelming Soviet firepower. IS-2 heavy tanks smashed through barricades, their massive guns blasting German strongpoints into dust. The city shook with constant bombardment, and armored duels erupted amid shattered buildings. German tank crews often fought until their vehicles were destroyed, knowing capture meant death or imprisonment. Civilians, soldiers, and SS fanatics crowded the streets, caught in the maelstrom of destruction. Every panzer lost was irreplaceable. Every shell fired a final defiance. Soviet tanks poured into the heart of the city, encircling the Reichstag and Hitler's bunker. The Panzers had fought to the bitter end, but the Reich was doomed. The dream of armored dominance ended in flames beneath the ruins of Berlin. The final battles of the Eastern Front marked both the destruction of the Panzer Divisions and the collapse of Hitler's empire. From Hungary to East Prussia, from the Oder to Berlin, German armor fought with desperate bravery, but could not overcome the weight of Soviet might. Hitler's obsession with counterattacks had squandered the last reserves of armored strength in hopeless offensives. Fuel, ammunition, and manpower were gone, leaving only courage and desperation to hold the line. The Red Army's victory was not merely strategic, but absolute, crushing the panzer force that had once terrorized Europe. Survivors limped westward, hoping to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets. For the tank crews who had lived through years of war, the end was bitter, an acknowledgement that their sacrifices had been in vain. The Battle of Berlin closed the book on the Panzer legend. From triumph in Poland and France to destruction in Berlin, the arc of Germany's armored divisions mirrored the rise and fall of the Reich. The last tanks burned in the ruins, a fitting symbol of a war lost. By 1945, the once proud Panzer Divisions were a shadow of their former selves, gutted by years of relentless combat. The attrition of machines was staggering, as production could no longer keep pace with battlefield losses. Germany's factories lay in ruins from Allied bombing, while vital resources such as steel and rubber had nearly vanished. The shortage of fuel crippled operations even more than the lack of tanks themselves. Crews often sat idle beside their machines, powerless to move them without precious gasoline. When offensives came, panzers sputtered forward only to halt within miles, drained of fuel. Tanks that had once spearheaded invasions now stood silent, abandoned by the roadside. The men who served within them felt a gnawing despair, knowing the weapons they loved had been reduced to monuments of futility. Training new crews became impossible, as veterans were killed faster than replacements could be prepared. The armored fist of the Wehrmacht, which had once smashed through Europe, had become brittle and weak. The panzer arm was collapsing not in one decisive blow, but in a slow bleed of exhaustion. The lack of trained crews was as damaging as the absence of fuel and machines. By late war, many panzer divisions consisted of hastily assembled teenagers and old men pressed into service. These inexperienced recruits were given only minimal instruction before being thrown into combat. Veteran tankers, those who had survived Poland, France, and Russia, were rare and often already dead. Without the practiced teamwork of seasoned crews, even the most advanced tanks were little more than steel coffins. Coordination within units broke down as communication networks collapsed under pressure. Tank commanders, once decisive leaders, were often killed within days of battle, leaving green recruits to flounder. The enemy they faced, the Soviets and the Western Allies, were now far superior in numbers and experience. Allied tanks and aircraft stalked panzers across every battlefield, striking from ranges and angles the Germans could no longer counter. The men inside knew their odds of survival shrank with every skirmish. They fought on, but the outcome was already written. Fuel shortages defined the final months of panzer operations more than any other factor. Germany's oil lifelines in Romania and Hungary had been cut, and synthetic fuel plants were obliterated by Allied bombers. A panzer division, once requiring thousands of gallons daily, now scrounged for barrels hidden in barns and farmhouses, Tanks were moved only at night to conserve fuel, and many remained camouflaged in woods, immobile and impotent. Entire formations were left behind, unable to retreat when Soviet and Allied offensives surged forward. Commanders made heartbreaking decisions to abandon perfectly functional tanks, setting explosives inside to prevent capture. Soldiers recalled the sickening sight of blowing up their own machines, steel giants they had trusted with their lives. The battlefield was littered with these hulks, charred skeletons marking the trail of retreat. Each abandoned panzer was a symbol of a war effort out of breath, out of hope. The mighty engines that once roared across Europe now coughed their last in fields and forests. The Panzer Divisions were dying, one stalled machine at a time. Retreat became the defining mode of German armored warfare in 1945. Gone were the days of sweeping offensives and bold encirclements. Instead, panzers were ordered to hold river lines, defend villages, and cover the withdrawal of infantry columns. This defensive role drained them of mobility, their greatest strength. Crews dug their tanks into the earth, turning them into stationary bunkers to resist Soviet and American advances. They fought ferociously when engaged, destroying enemy armor with well-placed ambushes. But every such stand ended the same: when ammunition ran out or flanking maneuvers cut them off, the crews were forced to flee. Many tankers marched westward on foot, carrying only rifles and memories of their machines. Retreat was not orderly but chaotic, marked by panic and despair. Civilians clogged the same roads, slowing military movement and adding to the misery. The panzers, once tools of Blitzkrieg, had become rear guards in a war already lost. Abandonment haunted the Panzer Divisions in their final months. Crews left tanks in ditches, burned them in villages, or simply walked away under orders. Each abandonment was accompanied by bitterness, for soldiers often saw their machines as comrades. For many tankers, their panzer was home, shield and lifeline, and to leave it behind felt like betrayal. Eyewitnesses described tears streaming down the faces of hardened men as they lit fuses to destroy their vehicles. The enemy often captured these machines, towing them away as trophies of war. Fields were scattered with blackened hulls, mute witnesses to the slow disintegration of an army. The psychological toll was immense, for crews knew their weapons had failed not from weakness, but from neglect and starvation of resources. Tanks that might have held the line a year earlier now sat rusting by the roadside. Abandonment was not just tactical, it was the symbol of final collapse. The panzer arm was crumbling not with glory, but with quiet despair. For the men inside, survival became the only goal as the Reich crumbled. Tankers who once believed themselves elite shock troops now found themselves fugitives from overwhelming enemy power. Many longed to surrender to the Americans or British, fearing the vengeance of the Red Army. Stories circulated of captured tankers, beaten or executed, feeding the desperation to escape westward. Panzer crews stripped insignia from their uniforms, trying to pass as ordinary soldiers. Some buried photographs, diaries and medals, hoping to erase their identities before capture. Yet even in these moments, the pride of the armored corps lingered. Veterans recalled the victories of earlier years, of lightning thrusts and triumphant marches, even as they trudged on foot. They were survivors of a shattered legend, men bound by steel that no longer existed. Reflection replaced triumph, as they questioned the sacrifices made and the meaning of their struggle. The collapse of the panzer arm was not only military, it was profoundly human. The Allies saw the results of this collapse as they advanced deeper into Germany. Columns of burned-out tanks lined highways and bridges, evidence of battles that lasted hours, not weeks. Villages filled with half-destroyed panzers stood as silent museums of destruction. Allied tankers marveled at the technical sophistication of German machines, even as they rolled past their wreckage. Many panzers were found intact, abandoned due to fuel shortages, their ammunition still stacked inside. For Allied soldiers, these sights underscored the desperation of a collapsing enemy. For German crews, however, they were a source of humiliation, proof of helplessness. War photographers captured these images, and they became icons of defeat. Powerful tanks abandoned, their crews vanished. The Allies had finally broken the myth of the invincible panzer. What remained were skeletons of machines and exhausted men, retreating from a war that could no longer be fought. The collapse was visible everywhere, from Berlin's streets to Bavaria's forests. In the aftermath, survivors of the Panzer Divisions reflected on their final days with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. Many spoke of the unbearable weight of attrition, where every friend lost seemed irreplaceable. They remembered nights of fear, knowing their tanks had no fuel to flee or fight. Some admitted to relief at the end, glad simply to survive after years of carnage. Others carried guilt, haunted by the destruction wrought during their years of conquest. Post-war memoirs often described the end of the Panzer arm as the death of a brotherhood, not just a weapon. The proud legacy of Blitzkrieg had dissolved into fragments of despair, leaving only memories and ruins. Survivors recalled their panzers like fallen comrades, machines that had shared their triumphs and their doom. The collapse was not sudden, but a slow suffocation, a long agony that ended only with surrender. The Panzer Divisions had been the sword of the Reich, but by 1945 the sword lay shattered, and with its fall, Germany's last hope for victory fell as well. With the fall of the Third Reich in May 1945, the surviving panzers that had once been the pride of Germany's military machine lay scattered across Europe. Many stood abandoned on roadsides, their fuel tanks dry, while others were captured intact by advancing Allied forces. The United States and Britain quickly gathered these tanks for study, eager to understand the technology that had once terrorized the world. Engineers marveled at the sloped armor of the Panther and the immense firepower of the Tiger, recognizing features that surpassed their own wartime designs. Soviet troops also recovered hundreds of German tanks, towing them east for trials at proving grounds. In workshops across Moscow, American factories, and British arsenals, the defeated Panzer became a subject of fascination and dissection. Each machine told a story of innovation and desperation, from advanced optics to overcomplicated gearboxes. The Allies sought to learn not just how the Panzers had been built, but why they had ultimately failed. What they discovered influenced decades of future tank development. For the Germans, these captured machines were no longer weapons. They were relics of a lost war, but for the victors they became stepping stones to a new armored age. The Soviet Union was particularly interested in the Panther, whose combination of firepower and protection had shocked their tank forces in 1943. Soviet engineers dismantled captured Panthers bolt by bolt, comparing them to their own T-30-485 and IS-2 designs. They admired the German gun stabilizers, optics and armor angling, but criticized the machine's mechanical unreliability. Soviet tank factories would later incorporate lessons from the Panther into their post-war tanks, most notably in the T-54, which became one of the most produced tanks in history. Meanwhile, Western allies tested Tigers and Panthers on ranges, pitting them against Sherman Fireflies, Comets, and Pershings. The results revealed both the strengths and flaws of the German machines, excellent in firepower, but prone to breakdowns and logistical nightmares. These captured Panzers were paraded in Allied newsreels, symbols of Germany's defeat and the triumph of Allied industry. Yet, behind the propaganda, a more serious study was unfolding. Each test, each evaluation, was building the blueprint for the next generation of global tank warfare. German engineering genius had left an undeniable mark, even in defeat. The Americans drew heavily from their study of panzers to improve their own armored doctrine. The M26 Pershing, introduced at the end of the war, already owed much to German influence, and post-war models went further. The M46, M47, and eventually the M48 pattern carried forward ideas of heavy frontal armor, larger caliber guns, and improved suspensions inspired by the lessons of the Panther. American gunners admired the advanced Zeiss optics used by German tank crews, which allowed accurate long-range fire. The US also recognized the danger of over-engineering, cautioning against the complexity that had doomed many German designs. While they respected the Tiger's armor and gun, they understood that its monstrous size was impractical for mass warfare. These lessons shaped a doctrine that favored reliability and quantity alongside firepower. For the Americans, the Panzer legacy was both a warning and an inspiration. The defeated enemy had shown them what a tank could be, and in doing so had defined the standards by which future designs would be judged. The British too examined captured Panzers closely, particularly the Tiger I and Tiger II. British gunners tested these tanks extensively on firing ranges, subjecting them to artillery shells and anti-tank weapons. They were impressed by the resilience of the German armor, but noted how easily mobility was compromised by mechanical failure. British designers who had struggled with underpowered tanks like the Cromwell saw in the Panther the potential for a new generation of armored vehicles. The Centurion tank, developed at the war's end, carried forward the balance of mobility, firepower, and armor that the Germans had pursued, but with greater mechanical reliability. In time, the Centurion would become one of the most successful tank designs in history, used by dozens of nations. Its legacy can be traced directly to the lessons learned from captured Panzers. For the British, studying these tanks was not just about winning the last war, it was about preparing for the next. The Panzer, even in defeat, was reshaping the future of armored warfare. For the Germans themselves, the fate of the Panzer Divisions was not merely mechanical, but judicial. At Nuremberg and subsequent trials, senior Panzer leaders faced questions about their roles in the war and their loyalty to Hitler. Generals like Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, were interrogated for their participation in Nazi campaigns. Some Panzer officers attempted to portray themselves as professional soldiers, separate from the crimes of the regime. Others were directly implicated in atrocities committed during anti-partisan operations and reprisals against civilians. The distinction between military necessity and war crimes was fiercely debated in courtrooms across Europe. Many commanders were sentenced to prison terms, while others were acquitted on grounds of following orders. For survivors of the Panzer Arm, the post-war years were marked by shame, captivity, and in some cases, execution. The trials ensured that the legacy of the Panzers would always be entwined with the moral reckoning of the Nazi war machine. No amount of military innovation could separate the tank from the crimes committed in its shadow. Despite the collapse of the Reich, stories of Panzer battles became legends among both veterans and historians. Memoirs written by former Panzer commanders painted tales of bravery, sacrifice, and tactical genius. Works like Heinz Guderian's Panzer Leader sought to preserve the image of the Panzer Divisions as noble instruments, betrayed by Hitler's flawed leadership. These narratives influenced early Cold War perceptions, especially in the West, where German expertise was suddenly valued against the Soviet threat. Former Panzer officers were even recruited into NATO advisory roles, sharing their knowledge with new generations of tank commanders. The myth of the Panzer as an unstoppable weapon persisted, despite the reality of its logistical fragility. Veterans of the Allied armies often countered these myths, reminding readers that it was Allied industry and Soviet resilience that crushed the armored spearhead. Still, the fascination with German tanks grew, filling books, museums, and films. The Panzer lived on not just as a machine, but as a symbol admired, feared, and scrutinized long after the war had ended. Captured German tanks also played a role in post-war propaganda. The Soviets paraded Tigers and Panthers through Red Square, presenting them as trophies of victory. Western nations displayed them in military museums and war memorials, where they became symbols of Allied triumph. For civilians visiting these sites, the sight of a Tiger tank was awe-inspiring, a reminder of the ferocity of the war just ended. Yet these machines, once feared on the battlefield, now stood as silent relics. They were stripped of fuel, ammunition, and purpose, reduced to teaching tools and curiosities. Historians and engineers studied them, while schoolchildren climbed upon their turrets during visits. The Panzer Divisions, once the pride of Hitler's armies, were now exhibits in the museums of his enemies. Their survival in this form ensured that their story would never be forgotten, but their presence also served as a reminder of how far the world had gone to defeat them. In the decades that followed, the influence of the Panzer Divisions spread far beyond Europe. Tank designers in Israel, India, and China drew lessons from German innovations, even as NATO and Warsaw Pact armies built their Cold War arsenals. The Panther's sloped armor became standard in virtually every tank built after 1945. The balance of firepower and mobility championed by German engineers defined armored warfare for generations. Yet the failures of the Panzer arm were also studied, their over-reliance on complex machinery, their lack of fuel, and their vulnerability to mass production. These lessons reminded the world that technology alone cannot win a war. In the end, the Panzers were both a warning and a blueprint. They represented the heights of innovation and the depths of hubris. Their post-war fate was to shape the future of global tank design, while standing as monuments to the devastation of total war. The Panzer had been born in fire and conquest, and in defeat, it became eternal in memory. The story of the Panzer Divisions did not end with Germany's surrender in May 1945, for their legacy stretched far beyond the war they were created to fight. They had demonstrated the potential of armored forces to reshape the very nature of modern conflict. Blitzkrieg, though misunderstood and exaggerated, showed how speed, shock, and coordination could paralyze an enemy before they had time to react. Tanks were no longer seen as auxiliaries to infantry, but as the decisive arm of battle. The combination of armor, mechanized infantry, artillery, and close air support became the template for mechanized warfare worldwide. Nations studied how the Panzers had moved through Poland and France, turning these operations into lessons of doctrine. Even the failures of the Panzer Divisions, such as overextension and logistical breakdowns, became cautionary tales. The battlefield of the future, military thinkers realized, would be dominated by mechanized maneuver. No longer could armies rely solely on static defenses or massed infantry charges. The Panzer Divisions had rewritten the book of modern war, and their shadow would loom over every armored army that followed. The myth of Blitzkrieg grew stronger after the war, fed by German generals who sought to salvage their reputations. Men like Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein published memoirs portraying themselves as innovators who had outwitted lumbering enemies only to be sabotaged by Hitler's interference. These narratives were eagerly consumed in the West, where the Cold War made German expertise valuable. Western armies admired the Panzers as symbols of ruthless efficiency, even when the reality had been far more complicated. The myth presented Blitzkrieg as a masterstroke, when in truth it was often improvisation, luck, and the enemy's weakness that brought victory. Nonetheless, this myth shaped post-war military thought, encouraging doctrines of speed, surprise, and decisive armored thrusts. NATO forces studied the campaigns of 1940 as blueprints for dealing with potential Soviet invasions of Europe. The Soviets, for their part, also analyzed Blitzkrieg closely, determined never again to be caught unprepared. Both sides of the Cold War armed themselves with mechanized armies built in the Panzer mold. In myth and reality, the legacy of the Panzer Divisions was undeniable. Technological influence was another enduring aspect of the Panzer legacy. The Panther's sloped armor became the global standard, its geometry copied by tanks from the Soviet T-54 to the American Men 48 pattern. The Tiger's 88 mm gun inspired weapons that combined long-range precision with devastating penetration. German optical sights and range-finding equipment were studied and imitated worldwide. Even the failures of German tanks, such as their mechanical unreliability, provided important lessons to engineers. The Allies recognized that it was not enough to build powerful tanks. They had to be maintainable, reliable, and capable of mass production. Cold War tanks like the Leopard 1, Centurion, and M60 reflected this balance between firepower, mobility, and practicality. At the same time, the legend of the Tiger and Panther lived on in military culture, inspiring generations of designers and enthusiasts. German engineering had created machines of fearsome reputation, and those reputations outlived the Reich itself. Thus, even in defeat, the Panzer Divisions set the bar for future armored innovation. Their influence became not just technical, but cultural. Strategically, the Panzer Divisions left behind lessons in both success and failure. They proved how operational shock could dismantle larger forces, as seen in France in 1940. Yet they also showed how overconfidence and poor logistics could lead to catastrophe, as in Russia in 1941 and beyond. The vast distances of the Eastern Front revealed the limits of Blitzkrieg, where speed was devoured by mud, snow, and Soviet resilience. German armored doctrine had thrived in short campaigns, but faltered in wars of attrition. The Allies and Soviets recognized this truth and adjusted their strategies accordingly. Industrial power, fuel supplies, and mass production outweighed tactical brilliance in the long run. The Panzer Divisions became a cautionary tale that innovation must be matched by sustainability. Military leaders after 1945 studied these campaigns not to imitate blindly, but to balance ambition with reality. Thus, the Panzer legacy was both a beacon of inspiration and a warning against hubris. It was as much about what to avoid as what to admire, and in this paradox lay its enduring relevance. Culturally, the Panzers became symbols of both awe and fear, appearing in films, books, and post-war imaginations. Movies depicted tigers looming over Allied Shermans, cementing their reputation as unbeatable giants. War games and military histories romanticized the armored duels of Kursk and Normandy. For survivors of occupied Europe, however, the Panzer was not a legend but a nightmare, a steel fist that crushed cities, villages, and lives. The roar of treads and the thunder of cannons meant death and destruction for countless civilians. This duality, admiration and terror, colored the way Panzers were remembered. Historians struggled to separate fact from myth, often caught between veterans' nostalgia and survivors' trauma. The Panzer Divisions became more than military units. They became cultural icons of mechanized war itself. To some they were marvels of engineering, to others they were monsters that embodied the horrors of Nazi aggression. In both views their image endured, and in endurance the Panzer became immortal. The Cold War amplified the Panzer's legacy as NATO and Warsaw Pact forces faced each other across divided Europe. Western armies recruited former Panzer generals to advise on strategy, using their wartime experiences to shape modern armored doctrine. The Bundeswehr, West Germany's new army, proudly carried forward Panzer traditions, building tanks like the Leopard that became world-class designs. In the East, the Soviet Union fielded massive armored forces, determined to overwhelm NATO in a mechanized clash, reminiscent of 1941. War planners on both sides expected that any future conflict would be decided by armored thrusts across Central Europe. The shadow of Blitzkrieg hung heavily over this preparation, influencing exercises, deployments, and war games. The Panzer Divisions had become a template for the armies of a new age. Though their creators had been defeated, their ideas had conquered the military imagination. Tanks and mechanized forces became the kings of Cold War battlefields in waiting. And in that, the Panzer's legacy had outlived Hitler's Reich. Yet, the lessons of the Panzer Divisions extended beyond tactics and technology into morality. For all their battlefield brilliance, the Panzers were instruments of a genocidal regime. They spearheaded invasions that led to mass suffering, deportations, and the Holocaust itself. Their victories paved the way for SS units and Einsatzgruppen to carry out atrocities in conquered territories. No discussion of their legacy can ignore the crimes committed in their wake. Military historians have long debated whether the Panzer arm was clean compared to the SS, but the truth is far darker. Wherever the Panzers advanced, occupation and brutality followed. The myth of the noble Panzer soldier must be weighed against the reality of destruction they enabled. This moral reckoning became part of their legacy too, a reminder that military innovation cannot be separated from the regime that commands it. The Panzer Divisions symbolized power, but also responsibility, and their story is a lesson in the danger of separating military glory from human cost. In the final measure, the legacy of the Panzer Divisions is both triumph and tragedy, inspiration and warning. They revolutionized warfare, showing the world the power of speed, coordination, and mechanized might. They influenced tank design, military doctrine, and Cold War strategy for generations. Yet they also revealed the perils of overconfidence, logistical weakness, and reliance on technology without sustainability. Their myths endure in culture, their innovations in military arsenals, and their crimes in the annals of history. The Panzer Divisions remain a case study in the dual nature of human invention, capable of brilliance but also destruction. For modern armies, they are reminders that technology alone cannot win wars. For humanity, they are reminders that power must always be balanced by conscience. The roar of Panzer engines may have faded, but their echo shapes the way we think about war to this day. In memory, the Panzer lives on, forever a symbol of both innovation and devastation.